I'm a creature of habit, so I always pack my toiletries the same way. When I opened my suitcase on the second morning and found everything rearranged, my medication moved, my underwear folded differently, I knew someone had been through our belongings. The hosts swore they never entered. The security footage told a different story. What started as a romantic weekend getaway turned into a nightmare that still keeps me checking locks and covering cameras wherever I stay. This is just one of 7 true stories about Airbnb experiences that went terrifyingly wrong, where the line between host and predator became dangerously blurred. My name is Sarah, and this happened in Portland, Oregon. During what was supposed to be a perfect anniversary weekend with my boyfriend, Marcus, in September 2023. We'd been together for 2 years, and he'd surprised me with a booking at this gorgeous Victorian house in the Pearl District. The listing photos showed exposed brick walls, vintage furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light. The host, Rebecca, had hundreds of 5-star reviews and a superhost badge, so we felt completely confident in our choice. Marcus and I both work demanding jobs in tech, so this weekend was our chance to disconnect and reconnect with each other. The house was even more beautiful in person, with original hardwood floors that creaked charmingly under our feet and antique fixtures that made everything feel like stepping back in time. Rebecca greeted us personally, a woman in her early 50s, with perfectly styled gray hair and the kind of warm smile that immediately put you at ease. She gave us a tour of the space, pointing out the fully stocked kitchen, the clawfoot bathtub, and the private garden where we could have morning coffee. "I want you to feel completely at home here," she said, her voice carrying that practiced hospitality that comes from years of hosting guests. "If you need anything at all, I'm just a phone call away. I live in the carriage house out back, so I'm close but not intrusive." The first day was absolutely perfect. We explored Powell's Books, wandered through the Saturday market, and found this incredible little restaurant that served the best seafood we'd ever tasted. That evening, we returned to the Airbnb with wine and takeout, planning to spend a quiet night in. The house felt like our own private sanctuary, isolated from the city noise despite being in the heart of downtown. I'm obsessively organized when I travel, a habit that drives Marcus crazy, but has saved us from forgetting important things more times than I can count. I always pack my toiletries in the same order: medications on the left side of my toiletry bag, skincare products in the middle, makeup on the right. My clothes get folded using the specific technique I learned from a YouTube video, with underwear always placed in the upper right corner of my suitcase, and my phone charger wrapped in a particular way that prevents tangling. When we got back that first night around 9, I went to grab my face wash from my toiletry bag. Everything looked normal at first glance, but something felt off. My prescription anxiety medication, which I always keep in a small orange bottle on the left side, was now on the right. My moisturizer had been moved from the center to the back. It was subtle enough that I almost convinced myself I was imagining things, but the more I looked, the more discrepancies I found. "Marcus," I called out, "did you move anything in my toiletry bag?" He looked up from his laptop, where he was checking work emails. "No, why would I? You know I don't touch your stuff." I examined my suitcase more carefully. My underwear, which I always fold using a specific method and place in a neat stack, had been refolded differently. Someone had attempted to replicate my organization system, but they'd gotten the details wrong. A pair of black lace panties I'd packed for Saturday night was now folded flat instead of rolled. My bras were stacked with the cups facing the wrong direction. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Someone had gone through our personal belongings while we were out exploring the city. They'd been careful, methodical even, trying to put everything back exactly as they'd found it. But they didn't know my systems, my particular way of organizing things. Marcus came over to look, and I could see his expression change as I showed him the evidence. His jaw tightened, and that protective instinct he usually kept in check began to surface. "You're absolutely sure about this?" "Positive. I've been packing the same way for years. Someone was definitely in here." We searched the rest of our belongings. Marcus's camera bag had been opened. His expensive lens caps were in the wrong compartments. His wallet, which he'd left in the inside pocket of his jacket, was still there, but his business cards were arranged differently. Nothing was missing, but everything had been examined, catalogued, violated. The thought of some stranger handling our most intimate possessions made my skin crawl. They'd touched my underwear, gone through my medication, examined our personal effects like we were specimens in some twisted laboratory. But what terrified me most was the precision of it all. This wasn't random snooping. This was systematic, practiced, deliberate. Marcus wanted to confront Rebecca immediately, but I convinced him to wait until morning. It was late. We had no concrete proof beyond my organizational habits, and part of me hoped there might be some innocent explanation. Maybe a cleaning service had been scheduled, and Rebecca forgot to mention it. Maybe there was some emergency that required entry. I was grasping at straws, but I needed to believe there was a reasonable explanation. That night, I barely slept. Every small sound the old house made seemed amplified in the darkness. The wind rattling windows sounded like someone trying to get in. The heating system's clicking and groaning felt ominous instead of cozy. I kept imagining eyes watching us from hidden cameras, someone studying our sleeping faces, our vulnerable moments. The next morning, I decided to conduct a test. Before we left for brunch, I arranged my belongings in very specific ways that would be impossible to replicate unless someone had photographed them beforehand. I placed a single bobby pin under my moisturizer jar, positioned my medication bottle at a precise angle to the bag's zipper, and arranged my earrings in a pattern that looked random but followed a specific logic only I would know. We spent the morning at a charming cafe in the Alberta district, trying to recapture the romantic mood of our getaway. The coffee was perfect, the weather was beautiful, and Marcus was being particularly sweet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every person who looked in our direction seemed suspicious. Every notification on my phone made me jump. When we returned to the Airbnb around 2 in the afternoon, my worst fears were confirmed. The bobby pin had been moved. My medication bottle was at a different angle. My earrings had been rearranged, but whoever did it had tried to recreate my pattern and failed miserably. This time, there was no doubt. Someone had entered our space again while we were gone, and they'd been even more invasive than before. They'd examined my test arrangements closely enough to attempt replication, which meant they knew I was aware of their presence and were trying to cover their tracks. Marcus was furious. His usually calm demeanor cracked completely as he stared at the evidence. "We're calling her right now. This is completely unacceptable." Rebecca answered on the second ring, her voice as warm and professional as always. "Sarah, how are you enjoying your stay? Is everything to your liking? Actually, we need to talk. It seems like someone has been in our room while we were out. Our belongings have been moved around." There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Oh my goodness, that's terrible. I'm so sorry you feel that way. I can assure you that no one from my team has entered the space since you checked in. We have a strict policy about guest privacy." Her tone remained perfectly pleasant, but there was something underneath it now. A defensive edge that hadn't been there during our initial meeting. Could it be that things just shifted during travel? Sometimes suitcases can look different after being moved around. No, this is definitely not travel shifting. Someone systematically went through our personal items and tried to put them back. Well, I really don't know what to tell you. Like I said, no one has been in there. Maybe you could double-check your own movements? Sometimes when we're in an unfamiliar space, we can forget where we put things. The gaslighting was subtle but unmistakable. She was suggesting that I was either lying or mentally unstable, making up stories about invasion of privacy. But her explanation didn't account for the specific ways my belongings had been rearranged, the clear evidence that someone had been studying our possessions. "We'd like to speak with you in person," Marcus interjected, taking the phone from me. His voice had an edge I rarely heard. "This is a serious violation of our privacy, and we need to resolve it immediately. Asterisk, of course, I understand you're upset. Why don't I come over in about an hour? I'm sure we can figure this out together." When Rebecca arrived, she brought a different energy with her. Gone was the warm, welcoming host from our first meeting. She seemed nervous, fidgety, her eyes darting around the room instead of making direct eye contact. She apologized profusely and offered various explanations. Maybe the cleaning crew had made a mistake. Perhaps maintenance had needed to check something. Possibly the wind had blown things around. But none of her explanations accounted for the specific details I documented. When I showed her exactly how my belongings had been moved, she grew increasingly uncomfortable. Her story kept changing, small inconsistencies that suggested she was making things up as she went along. "Look," she finally said, "I can see you're really distressed about this. Why don't I give you a partial refund for the inconvenience? Say 20% off your total stay." The offer felt like an admission of guilt. If nothing had really happened, why would she offer compensation? But it also felt like a bribe, an attempt to buy our silence about whatever had actually occurred. Marcus and I exchanged glances. We could take the money and leave, cutting our losses and trying to salvage what remained of our anniversary weekend. Or we could push harder for answers, potentially escalating a situation that was already uncomfortable and invasive. "We'll take the refund," I said finally. "But we're checking out today instead of tomorrow." Rebecca's relief was palpable. "Of course, whatever makes you most comfortable. I'll process the refund immediately." As we packed our belongings, I noticed Rebecca lingering outside our window, supposedly tending to garden plants but clearly watching our movements. When Marcus went to load our bags in the car, I saw her quickly walking away from our rental car, as if she'd been examining it as well. We left Portland that afternoon instead of Sunday morning, our romantic getaway cut short by the violation of our privacy and the unsettling behavior of our host. During the drive home, we pieced together other strange details we'd initially dismissed. The way Rebecca had seemed overly interested in our travel plans, asking detailed questions about where we'd be going and how long we'd be gone. The fact that she'd insisted on giving us the tour personally instead of just providing instructions for self-check in. 3 weeks later, I received a message through the Airbnb app that made my blood run cold. It was from Rebecca, sent at 2:17 a.m., and it simply said, "I hope you enjoyed your stay. You left behind such beautiful memories." Attached was a photo I'd never seen before. It showed Marcus and me sleeping in the bed at her Airbnb, taken from an angle that suggested it had been shot from inside the room. We were both clearly unconscious, vulnerable, completely unaware that someone was documenting our most private moments. I immediately reported the message and photo to Airbnb, but Rebecca's account was deactivated within hours, and all her listings disappeared. When I tried to research her further, I discovered that Rebecca Chen appeared to be a false identity. The carriage house address she'd given led to a property that had been sold 3 months earlier. The Portland police took my report but explained that without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The photo could have been taken by anyone with access to the property, and proving that Rebecca had systematically invaded our privacy would be nearly impossible. What haunts me most isn't just the violation of our belongings, or even the secret photography. It's the realization that we were completely defenseless, sleeping peacefully while someone watched us, studied us, collected information about our most intimate moments. The thought that this person might have done the same thing to dozens or hundreds of other guests makes me feel sick. We never found out what Rebecca's ultimate goal was. Was she selling personal information? Creating some kind of database of guest habits and belongings? Was this elaborate voyeurism, or something even more sinister? The questions keep me awake at night, and I'll probably never know the answers. I've stayed in probably 20 different Airbnbs since then, but I never unpack completely anymore. I set traps every time I leave, little tests to see if anyone has. Then in my space, I cover cameras, check for recording devices, and always pack my belongings in ways that would make tampering obvious. Trust, once broken in such a fundamental way, is almost impossible to rebuild. Every host's friendly greeting now seems potentially fake. Every welcoming gesture might be hiding darker intentions. The sharing economy is built on the assumption that strangers can be trusted with access to our most private spaces. But my experience with Rebecca proved how dangerous that trust can be. Asterisk. This happened to my friend David in New Orleans during Mardi Gras 2023, and I'm sharing it with his permission because people need to know how dangerous these situations can become when hosts cross boundaries. David had booked a small apartment in the French Quarter through Airbnb, specifically choosing it because it was within walking distance of all the major Mardi Gras events, but far enough from Bourbon Street to be relatively quiet. The host, a man named Felipe who claimed to be a local artist, had stellar reviews and had been hosting for over 5 years. The apartment was in a converted Creole townhouse, with exposed brick walls, high ceilings, and French doors that opened onto a small balcony overlooking a courtyard. Felipe met David personally for check-in, which seemed like excellent customer service at the time. He was a thin man in his 40s with prematurely gray hair and paint-stained fingers that suggested he really was an artist. He spoke with a slight accent that David couldn't quite place, possibly French or maybe just affected. New Orleans charm. During the tour, Felipe was extremely thorough, showing David not just the obvious amenities, but also demonstrating how to work the antique window latches, explaining the quirks of the old plumbing, and even pointing out the best spots on the balcony for photographing the courtyard. "I want you to have the most authentic New Orleans experience possible," Felipe said, his voice carrying that theatrical quality that many locals adopt when speaking to tourists. "This building has so much history, so much character. You're going to love staying here." The apartment itself was beautiful, decorated with local artwork and vintage furniture that felt genuinely curated rather than just furnished for rental purposes. The bedroom had a massive 4-poster bed that looked like an antique, and the bathroom featured a clawfoot tub that David was particularly excited to use after long days of walking around the festival. David's first 2 days were exactly what he'd hoped for. He spent his time exploring the city, sampling incredible food, and enjoying the festival atmosphere. The apartment provided a perfect retreat from the chaos, quiet and comfortable, with that distinctive New Orleans ambiance he'd been seeking. Felipe had left a bottle of local wine and a handwritten note with restaurant recommendations, touches that made David feel like a welcomed guest rather than just another customer. On the 3rd night, David returned to the apartment around midnight, after a particularly late evening watching parades and live music. He was exhausted but happy, looking forward to a good night's sleep before his final day in the city. The apartment felt different as soon as he walked in, though he couldn't immediately identify why. The air seemed heavier somehow, and there was a faint smell he didn't recognize, something medicinal or chemical that hadn't been there before. He attributed the strange feeling to fatigue and alcohol, took a quick shower, and settled into bed. The four-poster bed was incredibly comfortable, and despite the noise from the street below, David fell asleep almost immediately. He was used to city sounds, having lived in Chicago for years, so the distant music and occasional shouting didn't disturb him. What woke him up wasn't noise from outside. It was the sound of breathing that wasn't his own. David's eyes snapped open, and in the dim light filtering through the French doors, he could see a figure standing at the foot of his bed. The silhouette was tall and thin, definitely male, wearing what appeared to be dark clothing. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there watching him sleep, completely motionless like a statue. David's heart began pounding so hard he was certain the intruder could hear it. He forced himself to remain perfectly still, closing his eyes and trying to breathe normally while his mind raced. Was this Felipe, a thief? Some random person who'd broken in? How long had they been standing there watching him? Through barely opened eyelids, David could see the figure slowly moving around the bed, examining him from different angles like he was studying a museum exhibit. The movements were deliberate and quiet, suggesting familiarity with the space. This person knew exactly where the floorboards creaked, which areas to avoid. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, David heard the soft sound of footsteps moving toward the bedroom door. He waited several more minutes before carefully sitting up and looking around the room. He was alone, but the presence lingered in the air like a stain. David immediately checked the front door of the apartment. It was still locked, deadbolt engaged exactly as he'd left it. The windows were also secure, and he couldn't find any sign of forced entry. Whoever had been in his room had access to keys, which meant either Felipe had entered using his master key, or someone else with legitimate access had been watching him sleep. The thought made David's skin crawl. He'd been completely vulnerable, defenseless, while someone stood over his bed studying him. The violation felt almost physical, like an assault on his sense of safety and privacy. He considered calling the police, but what would he tell them? He hadn't been robbed or physically harmed, and he had no proof that anyone had actually been there. David spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair facing the bedroom door, dozing fitfully but never allowing himself to fall into deep sleep. Every small sound the old building made seemed threatening. The wind-rattling windows sounded like someone trying to get in. The settling of old wood felt like footsteps in the walls. When morning came, David immediately began examining the apartment for signs of entry or surveillance. He found something that made his blood run cold. A small hole in the bedroom wall, partially concealed behind a framed painting. The hole was about the size of a quarter, perfectly positioned to provide a view of the bed from an adjacent room or space. David moved the painting aside and peered through the hole. On the other side was what appeared to be a narrow space between walls, probably part of the building's original construction that had been walled off during renovations. The space was large enough for a person to stand in, and there were signs that it had been used recently. Scuff marks on the floor, what looked like a small cushion for kneeling. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Felipe hadn't entered the apartment during the night. He'd been watching from inside the walls, using a hidden space that David never could have discovered during a normal check-in tour. The midnight visitor hadn't been an intruder. It had been the host himself, emerging from his secret observation post to study his sleeping guest up close. David immediately began packing his belongings, his hands shaking with a combination of fear and rage. As he gathered his things, he noticed other details he'd missed. Tiny holes in the bathroom wall that could accommodate cameras, a mirror in the living room positioned at an odd angle that might be two-way glass, even a small gap in the kitchen. Cabinets that could provide a view of the entire main room. The apartment wasn't just a rental property. It was an elaborate surveillance system designed to monitor guests without their knowledge. Felipe had created the perfect setup for voyeurism, using the intimate nature of home sharing to gain access to people's most private moments. As David prepared to leave, he heard footsteps in the courtyard below. Looking out the French doors, he saw Felipe walking toward the building, carrying what appeared to be camera equipment. The host looked up at the apartment windows, and for a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Felipe's expression wasn't embarrassment or surprise. It was disappointment, like a child whose game had been interrupted. David grabbed his bags and ran down the stairs, pushing past Felipe without a word. He could feel the host's eyes following him as he hurried toward the street, but he didn't look back until he was safely in a taxi heading toward the airport. Later that day, from the safety of his Chicago apartment, David filed detailed reports with Airbnb, the New Orleans Police Department, and the Louisiana Attorney General's office. He provided photos of the peephole, the hidden space, and the suspicious positioning of mirrors and fixtures throughout the apartment. The investigation that followed revealed that Felipe had been operating his voyeurism business for years, using multiple properties and false identities. Police found hours of recorded footage showing dozens of unsuspecting guests in various states of undress and privacy. The hidden spaces in his properties contained sophisticated recording equipment and evidence of long-term surveillance operations. Felipe was eventually arrested and charged with multiple counts of voyeurism, illegal surveillance, and invasion of privacy. During the investigation, police discovered that he'd been selling recordings to online fetish communities and had even created custom videos based on specific requests from buyers. David's testimony was crucial in securing Felipe's conviction, but the emotional damage was significant. He struggled with sleep for months afterward, constantly feeling watched and vulnerable. The knowledge that his most private moments had been recorded and potentially distributed made him question every accommodation he'd ever stayed in. The case also revealed serious gaps in Airbnb's screening and monitoring processes. Felipe had been operating under multiple accounts with fabricated reviews and false credentials. The platform's verification system had failed to detect his pattern of suspicious behavior across different properties and identities. What makes David's story particularly disturbing is how normal everything seemed on the surface. Felipe appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a local artist offering authentic accommodations to visitors. His apartment was beautiful, his reviews were stellar, and his customer service was exceptional. There were no obvious red flags that would have warned David about the hidden surveillance system. The incident highlighted how vulnerable travelers can be when staying in private accommodations. Unlike hotels with standardized security protocols and professional oversight, Airbnb properties can be modified and equipped for surveillance without any external monitoring. Hosts have complete control over their spaces, and guests have no way of knowing what hidden features might be built into seemingly innocent rooms. David now exclusively stays in hotels when traveling, but he knows that his experience wasn't isolated. Felipe's arrest led to investigations of similar operations in other cities, revealing a network of voyeuristic hosts who were using home-sharing platforms to access and exploit unsuspecting guests. The trust that makes home sharing possible is also what makes it dangerous. When we stay in someone's private space, we assume they respect our privacy and dignity. But hosts like Felipe prove that assumption can be deadly wrong, and the intimate nature of these arrangements can be weaponized against the very people they're supposed to serve. Jessica and her boyfriend Tyler booked what seemed like the perfect mountain cabin in Asheville, North Carolina, for a long weekend in October 2022. They'd been dating for 8 months and wanted to experience the fall foliage together, away from their stressful jobs in Charlotte. The listing showed a cozy log cabin surrounded by colorful trees, with a stone fireplace, a hot tub on the deck, and breathtaking mountain views that promised a romantic getaway they'd been planning for months. The host, a woman named Carol, who described herself as a retired nurse and longtime Asheville resident, had exceptional reviews and offered what she called mountain hospitality with a personal touch. Her profile photo showed a friendly woman in her 60s with silver hair and a warm smile, holding a golden retriever puppy. Her listing description emphasized home-cooked meals, local hiking recommendations, and the kind of personalized service that made guests feel like family. When Jessica and Tyler arrived at the cabin on Friday afternoon, Carol was waiting for them with fresh-baked cookies and a bottle of local wine. The cabin exceeded their expectations, with rustic charm that felt authentic rather than manufactured, and modern amenities that ensured comfort without sacrificing atmosphere. Carol gave them a thorough tour, pointing out the best spots for photographing the mountain views, explaining how to work the wood-burning fireplace, and showing them the walking trails that started right from the property. "I just love having young couples stay here," Carol said, her voice carrying that maternal warmth that immediately put them at ease. "There's something so special about watching people fall in love with these mountains the way I did 40 years ago. I want to make sure you have everything you need for a perfect romantic weekend." She explained that breakfast was included in their stay, and that she'd prepare something special each morning using local ingredients and family recipes. "I hope you're hungry," she laughed. "I tend to go overboard when I'm cooking for guests. It's just my way of showing mountain hospitality." The first night was magical. They built a fire, opened the wine, and spent hours talking on the deck while watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant oranges and reds. The cabin felt completely isolated from the outside world, with no sounds except wind through the trees and the occasional call of night birds. They fell asleep to the gentle crackling of embers in the fireplace, feeling more connected to each other and to nature than they had in months. Saturday morning brought the first breakfast, and Carol had indeed gone overboard. She arrived at 8 o'clock sharp with a full spread: fluffy pancakes with local maple syrup, thick-cut bacon, fresh fruit salad, and what she called her special mountain blend, coffee. "I've been perfecting these recipes for decades," she said, watching with satisfaction as Jessica and Tyler began eating. "The secret is using ingredients from local farms and adding just a touch of mountain magic. I guarantee you've never tasted anything quite like this." The food was incredible. The pancakes were light and flavorful, the bacon was perfectly crispy, and the coffee had a rich, complex taste that was unlike anything they'd tried before. Jessica complimented Carol repeatedly, and Tyler actually asked for the coffee recipe, saying he'd never had anything so good. About an hour after breakfast, both Jessica and Tyler began feeling drowsy. At first, they attributed it to the large meal and the relaxing mountain air, but the sleepiness quickly became overwhelming. Jessica found herself struggling to keep her eyes open while they were sitting on the deck, and Tyler mentioned feeling weird and disoriented. "Maybe we're just tired from the drive yesterday," Jessica suggested, though she couldn't remember ever feeling quite so sluggish after a meal. "Let's just take a nap and see how we feel." They went inside and lay down on the cabin's king-size bed, intending to rest for an hour or so before exploring the hiking trails Carol had recommended. Instead, they both fell into an unnaturally deep sleep that lasted nearly 6 hours. When they finally woke up, it was late afternoon, and they felt groggy and confused, like they were emerging from anesthesia. Tyler was the first to voice what they were both thinking. "That wasn't normal. I feel like I'd been drugged." Jessica agreed that something was wrong, but they couldn't imagine why Carol would want to drug them. Nothing was missing from their belongings. They hadn't been harmed, and Carol had seemed genuinely caring and maternal. They convinced themselves that perhaps the high altitude or rich food had affected them more than expected. That evening, Carol stopped by to check on them and to invite them for what she called a special mountain dinner the following night. She seemed disappointed when they politely declined, saying they'd planned to drive into Asheville for dinner. Her friendly demeanor shifted slightly, becoming cooler and more formal. "Are you sure? I was planning something really special, just for you two. It's a family recipe that I only make for my favorite guests." There was something about the way she said "favorite guests" that made Jessica uncomfortable, though she couldn't articulate why. The phrase felt loaded with meaning that went beyond simple hospitality. Sunday morning brought another elaborate breakfast, and this time Jessica and Tyler were more cautious. They ate smaller portions and paid closer attention to how they felt. Afterward, within 45 minutes, the same overwhelming drowsiness began to set in, confirming their suspicions that something in the food was causing their symptoms. Tyler excused himself to use the bathroom and quietly dumped most of his remaining coffee down the sink. When he returned, he whispered to Jessica to stop eating. They politely finished what was on their plates while making conversation with Carol, then announced they were going for an immediate hike before the food could take full effect. Carol seemed agitated by their sudden departure, insisting that they should rest after such a large meal. "You really should let your food digest properly," she said, following them to the door. "The trails can be dangerous when you're not feeling your best." But Jessica and Tyler were already grabbing their jackets and heading outside, claiming they wanted to catch the morning light for photography. As they walked quickly toward the trailhead, Jessica looked back to see Carol standing in the cabin's doorway, watching them with an expression that was no longer maternal or welcoming. On the trail, away from Carol's presence, they discussed what was happening. Tyler was convinced that Carol was drugging their food, though they couldn't understand her motivation. Jessica was torn between suspicion and the desire to believe there was an innocent explanation. "Maybe she just uses too much vanilla extract or something," Jessica suggested. "Some people are more sensitive to certain flavors or ingredients." But Tyler wasn't buying it. "This isn't food sensitivity. We both passed out for 6 hours yesterday. That's not normal, no matter what we ate." They decided to cut their trip short, checking out that afternoon instead of staying for the final night. When they told Carol they had to leave early due to a family emergency, her reaction was immediate and intense. Her face flushed red, and her voice rose to an almost shrill pitch. "But you'll miss the special dinner I planned. I've been preparing for days, getting everything ready just for you. You can't leave now." The desperation in her voice was unsettling, confirming their suspicions that something was seriously wrong. This wasn't the disappointment of a host whose guests were leaving early. This was the reaction of someone whose plans had been disrupted. As they packed their belongings, Jessica noticed that some of their things had been moved around in the cabin. Her birth control pills, which she'd left in the bathroom, were in a slightly different position. Tyler's wallet, which he'd placed on the nightstand, had been opened and the contents rearranged. The realization hit them both simultaneously. While they'd been unconscious from the drugged food, Carol had been going through their personal belongings, possibly photographing their identification, credit cards, and other private information. They loaded their car quickly while Carol watched from the cabin's front porch, no longer bothering to maintain her friendly facade. Her expression was cold and calculating, like a predator whose prey had unexpectedly escaped. As they drove away, Tyler immediately called the local police from his cell phone. The officer who took their report seemed skeptical at first, but became more interested when Tyler mentioned the pattern of drugged food and the invasion of their belongings. "We've had a couple of other complaints about that property," the officer admitted. "Nothing we could prove, but similar stories about feeling unusually tired after meals and finding their things moved around." The investigation that followed revealed that Carol had been operating her drugging scheme for over 2 years, using her background as a nurse to calculate precise dosages that would incapacitate guests without causing obvious harm. She'd been photographing their identification documents, copying credit card information, and in some cases, Taking pictures of unconscious guests for unknown purposes, police found a sophisticated operation in Carol's actual residence, which was located about a mile from the rental cabin. She had files containing photocopied driver's licenses, credit card numbers, and personal information from dozens of guests. She'd been using this information for identity theft, opening credit accounts, and making purchases using her victims' identities. Even more disturbing was the discovery of hundreds of photographs showing unconscious guests in various states of undress. Carol had been posing and positioning drugged visitors for photographs, creating what amounted to a personal collection of non-consensual imagery. The drugging method was sophisticated and hard to detect. Carol had been using a combination of prescription sedatives mixed into her special Mountain Blend coffee, calculating dosages based on the estimated body weight and metabolism of her guests. Her nursing background had given her the knowledge to create a mixture that would reliably incapacitate people without causing obvious poisoning symptoms. Carol was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including assault, identity theft, illegal surveillance, and drug trafficking. The investigation revealed that she'd victimized at least 30 different guests over a 2-year period, generating thousands of dollars through identity theft and potentially selling photographs to online markets. For Jessica and Tyler, the emotional impact was severe and long-lasting. The knowledge that they'd been drugged and violated while unconscious created trust issues that affected both their relationship and their ability to travel. Jessica developed severe anxiety about food prepared by others, and Tyler became obsessively protective in social situations. The case also revealed serious problems with Airbnb's host verification system. Carol had been operating under her real identity with legitimate credentials, but the platform had no mechanisms for detecting or preventing the kind of systematic abuse she was perpetrating. Her stellar reviews were mostly legitimate, from guests who'd either been successfully drugged and didn't remember being violated, or who'd stayed before she began her criminal activities. The most chilling aspect of Carol's operation was how perfectly it exploited the trust inherent in home-sharing arrangements. Guests expected hospitality and personal attention from their hosts, so Carol's elaborate breakfast presentations seemed like exceptional service rather than drug delivery. Systems. The intimate nature of staying in someone's home made it easier for her to access personal belongings and create situations where guests would be vulnerable to her abuse. Jessica and Tyler's quick thinking and decision to leave early likely prevented them from becoming victims of Carol's most serious crimes. Other guests who stayed for full weekends were subjected to multiple drugging incidents and more extensive violations of their privacy and safety. The case highlighted how predators can exploit the intimate nature of home sharing to access victims in ways that would be impossible in traditional hotel settings. Carol's nursing credentials and maternal persona made her seem trustworthy, while her elaborate breakfast presentations disguised systematic drug administration as hospitality. This story comes from my colleague Marcus, who experienced something in a supposedly historic B&B in Salem, Massachusetts, that still affects how he travels today. Marcus is a software engineer from Boston who had booked a weekend stay in October 2023 to experience the famous Halloween festivities in Salem. He'd chosen what appeared to be a charming 18th-century colonial house that had been converted into a small bed and breakfast, MARKET, as offering an authentic historical experience with only 3 guest rooms. The host, an elderly man named Ezra, who claimed to be a local historian and descendant of one of Salem's founding families, had created an elaborate backstory for the property. According to his listing, the house had been in his family for generations and had witnessed many of Salem's most significant historical events. He offered guided tours of the property, shared stories about the house's past, and promised guests would experience the real Salem Away from the tourist attractions, Marcus was immediately charmed by Ezra's knowledge and passion for local history. The old man met him at the door, wearing period-appropriate clothing and speaking in a slightly formal manner that suggested someone who spent a lot of time thinking about the past. The house itself was beautifully preserved, with original wide plank floors, massive fireplaces, and windows that were clearly centuries old. "This house has seen so much history," Ezra explained as he led Marcus through the narrow hallways. "These walls have witnessed conversations that shaped our nation, tragedies that defined our community, and secrets that have been kept for generations. You'll be sleeping in the same room where traveling merchants once stayed, where Revolutionary War soldiers found shelter, where families hid during the witch trials." The room Marcus was assigned was on the second floor, with a window that looked out over Salem's historic district. The furniture appeared to be genuine antiques, and Ezra had provided period-appropriate details like hand-dipped candles, a ceramic water pitcher, and even historical documents framed on the walls. Everything felt authentic and immersive, exactly what Marcus had hoped for when booking the stay. The first evening was delightful. Ezra invited Marcus to join him for tea in the parlor, where they discussed Salem's history for nearly 2 hours. The old man's knowledge was encyclopedic, and his storytelling made the past feel immediate and alive. He shared details about the house's construction, the families who had lived there, and the historical events that had taken place within its walls. "The house remembers everything," Ezra said, his eyes twinkling in the candlelight. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just a caretaker, preserving memories that go back centuries. The walls have absorbed so much human experience that they've become repositories of our shared past." That night, Marcus slept peacefully in the antique four-poster bed, surrounded by the creaking sounds that old houses make as they settle. He felt connected to history in a way that no museum could provide, imagining the countless people who had slept in the same space over the centuries. The second day, Marcus spent exploring Salem's tourist attractions, visiting the witch trial memorials, and experiencing the Halloween festivities that draw thousands of visitors each October. When he returned to the B&B that evening, Ezra was waiting with another historical lecture, this time focusing on the specific events that had occurred in Marcus's room. 3 different families lived in that room during the witch trials, Ezra explained, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. They were hiding from accusations, trying to protect their children from the hysteria that was consuming our community. One of them, a young mother named Patience Greenwood, spent her final night in that room before being arrested and executed. The story was compelling but unsettling, and Marcus found himself thinking about it as he prepared for bed. The room felt different now, charged with the weight of the tragedies Ezra had described. Every shadow seemed to hold historical significance. Every sound carried the echo of past sorrows. That's when Marcus noticed something odd. The antique mirror hanging on the wall opposite his bed reflected the room at a slightly wrong angle. When he looked directly at it, the reflection showed his bed and the window behind it perfectly. But when he caught glimpses of it peripherally, the reflection seemed to show additional details that weren't actually there. Furniture that didn't exist. People who weren't in the room. Marcus moved closer to examine the mirror, and that's when he discovered it wasn't a mirror at all. It was a window, cleverly disguised to look like an antique mirror from his side, but actually providing a clear view into his room from whatever space was behind the wall. The reflection he'd been seeing was actually another room where someone could sit and observe everything that happened in his bedroom. The realization made Marcus's blood run cold. Ezra hadn't just been sharing historical stories. He'd been studying Marcus's reactions, learning his schedule, and potentially watching him during his most private moments. The elaborate historical presentations weren't just hospitality. They were reconnaissance missions designed to gather information about guests, personalities, and vulnerabilities. Marcus immediately began examining the rest of the room more carefully. The framed historical documents on the walls weren't just decorative. Several of them were positioned to conceal small holes that could accommodate cameras or microphones. The antique water pitcher on the nightstand had a small modification that could house recording equipment. Even the period-appropriate candles had been hollowed out to create hiding spots for surveillance devices. The entire room was an elaborate observation post, designed to monitor guests while maintaining the facade of historical authenticity. Ezra had created the perfect cover for voyeurism by combining it with legitimate historical education, making guests feel like they were experiencing something special rather than being surveilled. Marcus decided to test his theory. He went downstairs and told Ezra he was going out for the evening to experience Salem's nightlife. But instead of leaving, he circled around to the back of the house and looked for the space that would be behind his room's false mirror. What he found was a small addition to the house that wasn't visible from the front, connected to the main structure, but clearly built much more recently than the colonial-era portions. Through a window in this addition, Marcus could see into a room that was obviously Ezra's surveillance center. The space contained multiple monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the B&B, recording equipment, and what appeared to be files containing information about guests. Most disturbing was the chair positioned directly in front of the false mirror that looked into Marcus's room. The chair was clearly well used, with cushions worn from long periods of sitting, suggesting that Ezra spent significant time watching his guests' private activities. Marcus could see Ezra in the surveillance room, reviewing recorded footage on one of the monitors. From his position outside, Marcus could tell that the recordings showed previous guests in various states of undress and privacy, unaware that their most intimate moments were being documented and studied. The historical B&B was actually an elaborate voyeurism operation, using Salem's reputation for mysterious and supernatural experiences to explain away anything unusual that guests might notice. If someone reported strange sounds or unexplained feelings of being watched, Ezra could simply attribute them to the house's historical energy or residual supernatural activity. Marcus immediately left the property, checking into a mainstream hotel for his remaining night in Salem. The next morning, he filed detailed reports with local police and contacted Airbnb to report the hidden surveillance system. He also researched the property's actual history and discovered that Ezra's claims about the house's colonial origins were largely fabricated. The building had indeed been constructed in the 18th century, but it had been extensively modified and renovated over the centuries. The historical room where Marcus had stayed had actually been created during a 1980s renovation, and most of the period-appropriate furniture was reproduction pieces that Ezra had modified to accommodate his surveillance equipment. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Ezra wasn't his real name, and his claims about being descended from Salem's founding families were completely false. He'd created an elaborate persona to legitimize his operation, using people's interest in history and the supernatural to distract them from the very real violations of their privacy that were occurring. The investigation revealed that Ezra had been recording guests for over 3 years, accumulating hundreds of hours of footage showing people in their most private moments. He'd been particularly interested in couples, families with children, and single travelers who might be more vulnerable to his manipulation. Police also discovered that Ezra had been using the historical stories to psychological profile his guests, identifying those who seemed most trusting or naive and targeting them for more intensive surveillance. He developed detailed files on repeat visitors and had even attempted to blackmail some guests using compromising footage he'd recorded. The case highlighted how predators can exploit people's interests and hobbies to create opportunities for abuse. Ezra had identified that travelers interested in historical experiences were often more trusting and less suspicious of unusual accommodations. His elaborate historical persona made him seem like a harmless eccentric rather than a dangerous voyeur. For Marcus, the experience destroyed his ability to enjoy historical accommodations and made him suspicious of any host who seemed overly interested in sharing personal stories or cultural experiences. The violation of trust was profound, affecting not just his travel habits, but his general willingness to engage with strangers in intimate settings. The Salem Police Department worked with federal authorities to investigate whether Ezra had connections to similar operations in other historically significant locations. The investigation suggested that he might have been part of a network of voyeuristic hosts who targeted travelers interested in historical and cultural experiences. Asterisk. The story was shared with me by a woman named Linda, who experienced something deeply disturbing during what was supposed to be a peaceful solo retreat in the mountains of Vermont. Linda is a 34-year-old teacher from New York City who had been going through a difficult divorce and wanted to spend a long weekend somewhere quiet to process her emotions and plan her next steps. She'd booked a small cottage on a working farm in rural Vermont, attracted by photos showing a cozy cabin surrounded by rolling hills and descriptions promising complete privacy and solitude. The host, a family called the Millers, had excellent reviews and claimed to live in the main farmhouse while renting out the cottage to guests seeking authentic rural experience. The listing emphasized that guests would have complete independence and privacy, with the cottage located far enough from the main house to ensure no disturbance. The Millers promised fresh eggs from their chickens, vegetables from their garden, and the kind of peaceful environment that city dwellers rarely experience. When Linda arrived on a Friday afternoon in September 2023, she was greeted by Sarah Miller, a woman in her 40s with calloused hands and the kind of practical clothing that suggested she really did work on a farm. Sarah's husband Tom was repairing a fence nearby, and their 2 teenage children were visible doing chores around the property. Everything looked exactly as advertised, a genuine farming family offering authentic, rural hospitality. The cottage itself was charming, with rustic furniture, a wood-burning stove, and windows that looked out over pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. Sarah gave Linda a brief tour, explaining how to work the stove, where to find firewood, and pointing out the various farm animals that Linda might see during her stay. "We'll leave you completely alone unless you need something," Sarah assured her. "The cottage is yours for the weekend. We know city folk come here to get away from people, not to make new friends." That first evening was exactly what Linda had hoped for. She built a fire, opened a bottle of wine, and spent hours reading and journaling while listening to the peaceful sounds of farm life outside. The cottage felt completely private and secure, with no indication that the Miller family was anywhere nearby. Linda slept deeply that first night, lulled by the silence and fresh air that was so different from her noisy Manhattan apartment. When she woke up Saturday morning, she found a basket of fresh eggs and vegetables on her doorstep, along with a note from Sarah wishing her a peaceful day. The thoughtful gesture made Linda feel cared for without being intruded upon. Exactly the balance she'd been seeking. She spent Saturday hiking the farm's trails, reading by the pond, and enjoying the kind of solitude that had become rare in her busy urban life. That evening, as she was preparing dinner using the vegetables Sarah had provided, Linda noticed something odd. Through the cottage's kitchen window, she could see the main farmhouse clearly, and she realized that no lights were on despite it being well after dark. The house appeared to be completely empty, with no signs of the family she'd met the day before. Linda assumed the Millers had gone out for the evening, perhaps to visit friends or attend some local event. But as she continued watching throughout the evening, the farmhouse remained dark and appeared uninhabited. Even stranger, she didn't see any of the farm animals that had been visible during the day. The cattle were gone from the pastures, the chickens were nowhere to be seen, And the farm that had seemed so active during her arrival now felt completely abandoned. That Sunday morning brought another basket of fresh food, but Linda hadn't seen anyone deliver it. She'd been awake early, sitting by the window with coffee, and the basket had simply appeared on her doorstep without any indication of how it had gotten there. The food was fresh and clearly had been recently prepared, but there were no footprints in the dew-covered grass, no signs that anyone had approached the cottage. Linda decided to walk to the main farmhouse to thank the Millers for their hospitality and to satisfy her curiosity about their apparent absence. What she found made her question everything she thought she knew about her hosts. The farmhouse was not just empty. It was abandoned. The windows were dusty and some were cracked. The porch was covered with fallen leaves that clearly hadn't been disturbed in weeks, and the entire building had the neglected appearance of a property that hadn't been inhabited for a long time. Linda peered through the windows and saw furniture covered with sheets, dust-covered surfaces, and no signs of recent habitation. The kitchen where Sarah claimed to prepare meals for guests was obviously unused, with expired food in the refrigerator and a thick layer of dust on the counters. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the farm animals she'd seen during her arrival were also gone. The pastures were empty, the chicken coop was abandoned, and there were no signs that any animals had been on the property recently. The entire farm that had seemed so active and authentic was actually completely deserted. Linda returned to the cottage in a state of confusion and growing fear. If the Miller family didn't actually live on the property, who had greeted her during check-in? Who had been leaving the fresh food? And most importantly, who was responsible for maintaining the elaborate facade of an active working farm? That afternoon, Linda called the phone number listed in her Airbnb booking confirmation to ask about the situation. The call went directly to voicemail, but the voice on the recording wasn't Sarah Miller's. It was a man's voice with a different accent, and the message simply said to leave details about any problems, and someone would respond as soon as possible. Linda left a detailed message explaining her concerns about the abandoned farmhouse and requesting clarification about who was actually managing the property. She never received a response. As evening approached, Linda became increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. The cottage was isolated. She had no way of knowing who was really responsible for the property, and the elaborate deception she'd discovered suggested something much more sinister than simple false advertising. That night, Linda barely slept. Every sound outside seemed threatening, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched by whoever was responsible for maintaining the Miller family illusion. Around 3 a.m., she heard what sounded like voices outside the cottage, but when she looked out the windows, she couldn't see anyone. The voices were discussing her by name, commenting on her activities during the day and speculating about how long she would stay. The conversation suggested that multiple people were involved in monitoring her, and that they'd been watching her more closely than she'd realized. Linda immediately began packing her belongings, planning to leave at first light, rather than staying for her scheduled checkout time. As she gathered her things, she noticed that some of her personal items had been moved around in the cottage. Her journal, which she'd left on the coffee table, was now on the knitstand. Her toiletries in the bathroom had been rearranged. Someone had been entering the cottage while she was outside, going through her belongings and monitoring her activities even more closely than she'd suspected. The fresh food deliveries weren't just hospitality. They were opportunities for whoever was really running the operation to access her private space and study her habits. Linda left the property before dawn, driving directly to the nearest police station to report what she'd discovered. The investigation that followed revealed an elaborate and disturbing operation that had been targeting solo travelers for months. The real Miller family had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, but someone had been using their identities and property to operate an illegal surveillance and exploitation scheme. The working farm experience was completely fabricated. created using temporary actors and rented animals that were brought in only when guests were scheduled to arrive. The cottage had been equipped with hidden cameras and recording devices, and the people running the operation had been documenting guests' private activities for unknown purposes. They'd been particularly interested in solo female travelers, who they viewed as more vulnerable and less likely to investigate discrepancies in their accommodations. Police discovered that the operation was being run by a group of individuals who specialized in identity theft and had been using the information gathered from surveillance to commit various crimes. They'd been accessing guests' personal belongings to photograph identification documents, credit cards, and other sensitive information. Even more disturbing was the discovery that some guests had been drugged during their stays, using substances added to the fresh food that was delivered to their cottages. The drugs were designed to make guests more compliant and less aware of their surroundings, making it easier for the criminals to access their belongings and monitor their activities. Linda's decision to leave early likely prevented her from becoming a victim of the operation's most serious crimes. Other guests who had stayed for full weekends had been subjected to more intensive surveillance and had their identities stolen for use in various criminal schemes. The case highlighted how criminals can exploit the trust inherent in rural and family-oriented accommodations to create opportunities for serious crimes. The Miller family persona was carefully constructed to appeal to travelers seeking authentic, wholesome experiences, making guests more trusting and less suspicious of unusual circumstances. For Linda, the experience created lasting trauma that affected both her ability to travel alone and her general trust in accommodation providers. The knowledge that she'd been watched and potentially drugged while believing she was in a safe, family-run environment made her question her ability to assess dangerous situations. The investigation also revealed serious gaps in Airbnb's verification processes for rural properties. The platform had no mechanisms for verifying that host families actually existed or that the experiences they advertised were genuine. The Miller imposters had been able to operate for months using stolen identities and fabricated credentials. This story comes from my friend Rachel, who experienced something terrifying in what appeared to be a charming artist's loft in Portland, Oregon. Rachel is a 29-year-old graphic designer who frequently travels for work and had booked the space for a 3-day business trip in November 2023. The listing showed a beautifully converted warehouse space filled with artwork, with high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and large windows that provided perfect natural light for someone in a creative field. The host, a man named David who described himself as a painter and sculptor, had an impressive portfolio of artwork displayed in his listing photos. His space appeared to be a genuine artist studio that he rented out to fellow creatives when he traveled for gallery shows. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive, with guests praising David's hospitality and the inspiring atmosphere of his workspace. When Rachel arrived on a Tuesday evening, David met her at the door wearing paint-stained clothes and carrying a palette that suggested he'd been working on a piece when she arrived. The loft exceeded her expectations, with original artwork covering nearly every wall and sculptures positioned throughout the space that created an immersive, artistic environment. "I hope you don't mind the creative chaos," David said with an apologetic smile as he showed her around. "I've been working on a new series, and I tend to get completely absorbed when inspiration strikes. Feel free to look at anything that interests you, and please let me know if you have any questions about the pieces." The artwork was genuinely impressive, ranging from realistic portraits to abstract sculptures that demonstrated considerable technical skill. Rachel, with her background in design, could appreciate the quality and creativity of David's work. The space felt like a real artist's studio rather than a manufactured experience designed for tourists. David explained that he'd be working in his private studio in the basement during her stay, so she shouldn't worry about disturbing him. He gave her keys to the main space and assured her that she'd have complete privacy for her work meetings and design projects. "I know how important it is for creative people to have uninterrupted space," he said. "I've tried to create an environment where guests can feel inspired while also having all the practical amenities they need for work or relaxation." The first day went perfectly. Rachel had her business meetings in the lofts conference area, which David had set up with professional lighting and a high-quality camera for video calls. The space was ideal for her work, and she found herself feeling more creative and productive than she usually did in sterile hotel rooms. That evening, Rachel spent time examining David's artwork more closely. As she moved through the space, she began to notice something unsettling about the portrait paintings. While the subjects varied widely in age, gender, and ethnicity, they all shared certain characteristics that seemed oddly familiar. The more she studied the portraits, the more convinced she became that she'd seen these faces before. Not the specific individuals, but the expressions, the poses, the particular way each subject was looking at the viewer. There was something intimate and personal about the paintings that suggested the artist had spent considerable time studying his subjects. Rachel pulled out her phone and began taking photos of the portraits, planning to study them more carefully. Later, as she moved through the collection, she noticed that some of the paintings included details that seemed to indicate the subjects weren't professional models. There were personal items in the backgrounds, casual clothing, and informal poses that suggested these were people in their private spaces rather than in a studio setting. One portrait in particular caught her attention. It showed a young woman with curly red hair sitting in what appeared to be a hotel room or temporary accommodation. The woman was wearing pajamas and appeared to be unaware that she was being observed. Captured in a moment of private relaxation, felt voyeuristic rather than artistic. Rachel realized with growing horror that the portrait showed details of the room she was currently staying in. The exposed brick wall in the background, the specific pattern of the wood floor, even the placement of the windows matched her current surroundings exactly. The painting depicted someone who had stayed in this exact space, painted by an artist who had been studying them without their knowledge. She began examining the other portraits with this new understanding, and found that many of them included details that suggested they'd been painted from observation of people in private settings. Hotel rooms, apartments, temporary accommodations. The backgrounds in the paintings told a story of an artist who specialized in capturing subjects who were unaware they were being watched. Rachel immediately began searching the loft for hidden cameras or surveillance equipment. What she found was even more disturbing than she'd expected. David hadn't just been using obvious recording devices. He'd integrated surveillance equipment into his artwork itself. Several of the sculptures contained hidden cameras positioned to capture different angles of the living space. The decorative mirrors placed throughout the loft were actually two-way glass that allowed observation from David's basement studio. Even some of the paintings had small modifications that concealed recording equipment, turning his entire art collection into an elaborate surveillance system. The artistic environment that had seemed so inspiring and authentic was actually a carefully designed observation chamber, created by someone who used his creative talents to exploit and document his guests' private moments. Rachel realized that David's claim about working in his basement studio was probably a lie. He was likely downstairs watching her through his surveillance system, possibly painting her portrait, based on the recordings he was making. The thought of being studied and documented like a lab specimen made her physically ill. She immediately began packing her belongings while trying to appear normal in case David was watching. Rachel had learned enough about surveillance from her work in digital design to know that sudden changes in behavior might trigger a more dangerous response from someone who was already violating her privacy. As she gathered her things, Rachel discovered evidence that confirmed her worst fears. In a drawer that she'd assumed contained art supplies, she found photographs of previous guests in various states of undress and privacy. The photos were clearly taken without consent, showing people sleeping, changing clothes, and engaging in private activities that they'd assumed were unobserved. Even more disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be sales records showing that David had been selling both paintings and photographs of his guests to private collectors. The artistic residency was actually a commercial voyeurism operation, using the appeal of staying in a real artist's studio to attract victims who would be flattered by the creative environment and less suspicious of unusual accommodations. Rachel found detailed notes that David had written about previous guests, analyzing their personalities, habits, and physical characteristics like a scientist studying laboratory animals. He'd been using his artistic training to create psychological profiles of his victims, identifying those who were most trusting and least likely to discover his surveillance operation. The notes revealed that David specifically targeted people in creative fields, believing they would be more impressed by his artistic credentials and less likely to question the unusual features of his space. He'd been operating his scheme for over 3 years, creating hundreds of unauthorized portraits and selling both artwork and photographs to clients who were interested in voyeuristic content. Rachel managed to leave the loft without alerting David to her discovery, claiming she had a family emergency that required her to check out early. She immediately went to the Portland Police Department and filed a detailed report, providing photos of the hidden surveillance equipment and the unauthorized images she'd found. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of David's operation. Police found thousands of images and videos documenting the private activities of over 200 different guests. David had been using his artistic skills to create detailed studies of people without their consent, turning voyeurism into a profitable business. Even more disturbing was the discovery that David had been sharing his techniques with other artist hosts in different cities, creating a network of surveillance operations disguised as creative accommodations. He'd been teaching other people how to integrate recording equipment into artwork and how to use artistic personas to gain their victims' trust. David was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including illegal surveillance, invasion of privacy, and operating a criminal enterprise. The investigation revealed that he'd generated tens of thousands of dollars by selling unauthorized images and artwork based on his covert observations of guests. For Rachel, the experience destroyed her ability to enjoy artistic accommodations and made her suspicious of any host who seemed overly invested in sharing their creative work with guests. The violation of trust was particularly damaging because David had exploited her professional interest in art to make her feel comfortable in an environment that was actually designed to exploit her. The case highlighted how predators can use legitimate interests and talents to create opportunities for abuse. David's genuine artistic abilities made his cover story believable, and his studio space was authentic enough to fool even professionals in creative fields. His operation succeeded because it combined real artistic merit with criminal surveillance, making it nearly impossible for victims to detect the deception. The Portland Police Department worked with federal authorities to investigate the network of artist hosts that David had been connected to, leading to additional arrests and the discovery of similar operations in several other cities. The case revealed that criminals were increasingly using shared interests and professional connections to target specific types of victims. Asterisk, the final story I want to share comes from a couple named Mike and Jennifer who experienced something in rural Montana that still gives them nightmares 2 years later. This incident occurred during what was supposed to be a romantic anniversary trip in August 2023, and it reveals how some Airbnb hosts have found ways to exploit their guests for financial gain in ways that go far beyond simple theft. Mike and Jennifer had been married for 5 years and wanted to celebrate their anniversary somewhere remote and beautiful, away from their stressful jobs in Seattle. They'd found what appeared to be the perfect cabin rental in the mountains of Montana, advertised as a luxury wilderness retreat with hiking trails, a private lake, and all the amenities needed for a romantic getaway. The host, a man named Robert, who claimed to be a retired contractor turned wilderness guide, had constructed the cabin himself using local materials and traditional building techniques. His listing emphasized the authentic Montana experience, with no cell phone service, no internet, and no distractions from the natural beauty that surrounded the property. The photos showed a beautiful log cabin with a stone fireplace, wraparound deck, and panoramic views of the surrounding mountains. Robert's reviews were excellent, with guests praising both the beauty of the location and his knowledge of local hiking trails and wildlife viewing opportunities. Mike and Jennifer arrived at the cabin on a Friday afternoon. Robert was waiting to give them a personal tour and orientation. He was a large man in his 50s with calloused hands and the kind of deep tan that comes from spending most of your time outdoors. Everything about him suggested someone who really did live and work in the wilderness. "This is some of the most beautiful country in the world," Robert told them as he showed them around the property. "I've been guiding people through these mountains for 20 years, and I never get tired of sharing this place with folks who can appreciate what nature has to offer." The cabin was even more impressive in person than in the photos. Robert had clearly put considerable time and money into creating a luxury experience in a wilderness setting. The kitchen was fully equipped with high-end appliances. The bathroom featured a clawfoot tub with mountain views, and the bedroom had been positioned to take advantage of sunrise views over the valley. Robert explained that the property was completely off-grid, powered by solar panels and a backup generator, with water from a private well that he maintained himself. He gave them detailed instructions about conserving power and water, showed them where to find emergency supplies, and provided maps of the hiking trails that started right from the cabin. "The nearest neighbor is about 10 miles away," he told them, "so you'll have complete privacy out here. That's what most people come for, the chance to disconnect from civilization and reconnect with each other and with nature." The isolation that Robert described as a selling point would later become a source of terror. But initially, Mike and Jennifer were thrilled with the complete privacy and stunning natural beauty that surrounded them. Their first 2 days were perfect. They hiked through pristine wilderness, saw wildlife including elk and eagles, and spent their evenings relaxing on the deck while watching incredible sunsets paint the mountains in brilliant colors. The cabin provided luxury accommodations while still feeling authentic and connected to the natural environment. Saturday evening, as they were preparing dinner, Jennifer noticed smoke coming from the direction of the cabin's electrical panel. Within minutes, the situation escalated rapidly as sparks began flying from the panel and the smell of burning electrical components filled the air. Mike immediately tried to contact Robert using the emergency radio he'd provided, but received no response. The solar power system was clearly malfunctioning, and with no cell phone service and no nearby neighbors, they were completely on their own to deal with what was rapidly becoming a dangerous situation. The electrical fire spread quickly through the cabin's wiring system, despite Mike's attempts to shut off the main power supply. Within 20 minutes, they were forced to evacuate the building as flames began spreading through the walls and roof. Standing outside in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes they were wearing, Mike and Jennifer watched the cabin burn completely to the ground. The remote location that had seemed so romantic now felt terrifying as they realized they were stranded in the wilderness with no transportation, no communication, and no shelter. They spent that night sleeping in their rental car, using the emergency supplies Robert had shown them to stay warm and hydrated. The next morning, they hiked to the main road and flagged down a passing vehicle to get help and contact emergency services. When the fire department finally arrived to investigate the scene, they immediately identified several suspicious factors about the fire. The electrical system had been modified in ways that made a malfunction almost inevitable, and there were signs that accelerants had been used to ensure the fire would spread quickly and completely destroy the structure. Even more damning was the discovery that Robert had increased his insurance coverage on the cabin just 3 weeks before Mike and Jennifer's visit, and that this wasn't the first property he'd owned that had been destroyed by accidental fires. The investigation revealed that Robert had been operating an elaborate insurance fraud scheme, using Airbnb guests as unwitting accomplices in the destruction of his properties. He would rent out cabins or houses for just long enough to establish their value and generate positive reviews, then arrange for accidents to occur during guest stays that would result in total losses he could claim against his insurance policies. The electrical modifications that caused the fire in Mike and Jennifer's cabin had been deliberately designed to malfunction, creating what would appear to be an accidental fire but was actually a planned destruction. Robert had been using his background in construction to create disasters that would look natural while being completely intentional. Most disturbing was the discovery that Robert had been putting his guests' lives at risk to maintain the credibility of his fraud scheme. If Mike and Jennifer had been sleeping when the fire started, or if they'd been unable to evacuate quickly enough, they could have been seriously injured or killed to protect Robert's financial interests. The investigation uncovered evidence that Robert had destroyed at least 4 different properties over the past 3 years, generating over $800,000 in fraudulent insurance claims. He'd been using the rental income from Airbnb to maintain the properties just long enough to establish their value, then arranging for their destruction in ways that would appear accidental. Robert's scheme was particularly sophisticated because he used real guest reviews and legitimate rental income to establish the properties' value and his credibility as a property owner. Insurance companies were more likely to pay claims for properties that had documented rental income and positive guest feedback, making the Airbnb listings an essential part of his fraud operation. The remote locations he chose for his properties weren't just about providing authentic wilderness experiences. They were strategically selected to ensure that fires would burn completely before emergency services could respond, eliminating evidence and maximizing damage claims. Mike and Jennifer lost all of their personal belongings in the fire, including jewelry, electronics, and sentimental items they'd brought for their anniversary celebration. But the emotional trauma was much worse than the financial losses. They'd been used as pawns in a criminal scheme that could have cost them their lives, and the knowledge that their romantic getaway had been planned as the site of an insurance fraud made them feel violated and manipulated. Robert was eventually arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including insurance fraud, arson, and reckless endangerment. The investigation revealed that he'd been planning to expand his operation to other states, using the money from his fraudulent claims to purchase and modify additional properties for destruction. The case highlighted a disturbing trend of criminals using Airbnb and other home-sharing platforms to create legitimate-appearing covers for various types of fraud. The trust and documentation inherent in these platforms can be exploited to establish credibility for criminal operations that would be harder to execute through traditional means. For Mike and Jennifer, the experience destroyed their ability to enjoy remote accommodations and made them suspicious of any rental property that seemed too good to be true or was located in very isolated areas. The knowledge that they'd been selected as potential casualties in someone else's financial scheme created lasting trust issues that affected their relationship and their willingness to travel. The insurance industry has since begun implementing additional verification procedures for properties with rental income. But the case demonstrated how criminals can exploit the legitimacy that platforms like Airbnb provide to create covers. This final story comes from a medical researcher named Dr. Emily Chun, who experienced something in a supposedly luxury wellness retreat in Costa Rica that revealed how some international Airbnb hosts exploit guests for purposes far more sinister than simple theft or voyeurism. Emily had booked what was advertised as a cutting-edge wellness center that combined traditional spa treatments with advanced medical therapies, specifically targeting health-conscious professionals seeking rejuvenation. The host, who called himself Dr. Andreas Muller and claimed to be a Swiss physician specializing in anti-aging medicine, operated what appeared to be a legitimate medical spa in a remote mountainous region outside San Jose. His listing emphasized privacy, luxury accommodations, and personalized treatment programs designed by medical professionals. The photo showed a beautiful compound with modern medical facilities, luxury guest suites, and panoramic views of the Costa Rican rainforest. Emily, who was 34 and working as a research scientist at a pharmaceutical company in Boston, had been experiencing burnout from her demanding career and was attracted to the idea of combining a vacation with health optimization. Dr. Muller's credentials seemed impressive, and his reviews from previous guests praised both the luxury of the accommodations and the effectiveness of his treatments. When Emily arrived at the compound on a Monday afternoon in January 2024, she was immediately impressed by the professionalism of the operation. Dr. Muller met her personally, wearing a white lab coat and carrying a tablet with what appeared to be her medical intake information. He was a tall, thin man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of precise manner that suggested genuine medical training. "Welcome to our wellness center," he said in accented English that did sound authentically Swiss. "We're going to create a completely personalized program based on your unique physiological profile. By the time you leave here, you'll feel like a new person." The initial consultation was thorough and seemingly legitimate. Dr. Muller asked detailed questions about Emily's medical history, current medications, lifestyle habits, and health goals. He explained that the center used advanced diagnostic techniques to identify nutritional deficiencies, hormonal imbalances, and other factors that might be affecting her energy and well-being. The guest suite where Emily would be staying was indeed luxurious, with a private balcony overlooking the rainforest, a marble bathroom with a soaking tub, and high-end furnishings that suggested significant investment in the facility. Everything appeared exactly as advertised, and Emily felt confident that she'd made an excellent choice for her wellness retreat. The first red flag came during the blood draw on Tuesday morning. Emily, with her background in medical research, was familiar with standard blood collection procedures, but Dr. Muller's technician drew significantly more blood than would be needed for typical wellness testing. When Emily questioned this, Dr. Muller explained that their advanced genetic and metabolic testing required larger samples to provide comprehensive results. "We're not just looking at basic markers," he said, reviewing her chart with apparent scientific rigor. "We're doing cutting-edge analysis that most facilities can't provide. The additional volume allows us to run multiple specialized tests that will give us unprecedented insight into your physiological status. Emily accepted this explanation, though something about the technician's nervous behavior and the unusual equipment in the medical facility made her slightly uncomfortable. The laboratory looked more advanced than many research facilities she'd worked in, with equipment that seemed designed for purposes beyond simple wellness testing. The treatments began that afternoon with what Dr. Muller called cellular optimization therapy. Emily was taken to a private treatment room where she was given an 4 infusion that Dr. Muller claimed contained vitamins, minerals, and proprietary compounds designed to enhance cellular function and energy production. "This is the future of medicine," he explained as the technician prepared the IV. "We're not just treating symptoms. We're optimizing your body at the molecular level. You'll feel the effects within hours." The infusion made Emily feel strange almost immediately. Not sick exactly, but different in a way she couldn't articulate. Her thinking felt slightly fuzzy, and she experienced a mild euphoria that reminded her of prescription painkillers she'd taken after a surgery years earlier. When she mentioned this to Dr. Muller, he assured her that altered sensations were normal as her body adjusted to the optimization process. That evening, Emily felt increasingly disoriented and found it difficult to concentrate. She'd planned to read research papers she'd brought for the trip, but couldn't focus on the text. When she tried to use her laptop to check email, she discovered that the internet connection in her room wasn't working and her cell phone had no signal despite the compound claiming to have excellent connectivity. Dr. Muller explained that the communication limitations were intentional, designed to help guests disconnect from work stress and focus on their healing journey. "Digital detox is an essential part of our program," he said. "You'll be amazed how much better you feel when you're not constantly connected to the outside world." Wednesday brought more intensive treatments, including injections that Dr. Muller claimed would optimize her hormone levels and enhance her immune system. Emily's medical training made her concerned about receiving injections of unknown substances, but Dr. Muller provided detailed explanations and showed her scientific papers that appeared to support his methods. The problem was that Emily's increasing mental fog made it difficult for her to properly evaluate the information he was providing. The papers looked legitimate, but she couldn't concentrate well enough to read them thoroughly or identify potential problems with the research methodology. By Thursday, Emily was experiencing memory gaps and found herself unable to remember specific details about her treatments or conversations with Dr. Muller. She knew something was wrong but felt powerless to articulate her concerns or take action. The cognitive effects of whatever she was being given made it nearly impossible for her to think critically or plan an escape. It was during a moment of temporary mental clarity on Friday morning that Emily realized she was being drugged systematically and used as a test subject for experimental treatments. She overheard Dr. Muller speaking to his technician in what sounded like German, discussing dosages and side effects in clinical terms that made it clear she was part of some kind of medical experiment. Emily forced herself to appear compliant while secretly trying to regain her mental faculties. She began palming pills instead of swallowing them and pretending to be more affected by the treatments than she actually was. As her head cleared slightly, she realized that the wellness center was actually an illegal human experimentation facility. Dr. Muller wasn't providing wellness treatments. He was testing experimental drugs and procedures on unsuspecting guests who had paid to be his test subjects. The remote location, the communication blackout, and the elaborate medical setup were all designed to facilitate unethical human experimentation disguised as luxury healthcare. Emily discovered that other guests at the facility were in various states of cognitive impairment from the experimental treatments. Some appeared to be experiencing severe side effects, while others seemed completely unaware of their surroundings. The wellness retreat was actually a human laboratory, where paying customers were used as guinea pigs for dangerous medical experiments. The most disturbing discovery was that Emily wasn't Dr. Muller's first research scientist guest. She found evidence that he specifically targeted medical professionals, believing that their scientific backgrounds would make them more trusting of experimental treatments and less likely to question sophisticated-sounding explanations. Emily realized that her escape needed to be immediate and secret. On Saturday morning, she pretended to be more sedated than she actually was, and managed to slip away from the compound during what appeared to be a shift change among the staff. She made her way through the rainforest to a main road, where she flagged down a passing vehicle and convinced the driver to take her to the nearest police station. The investigation that followed revealed that Dr. Muller was not a licensed physician and had been operating illegal human experimentation facilities in multiple countries. The Costa Rican facility was just one location in an international network that targeted wealthy tourists seeking alternative medical treatments. Dr. Muller had been testing experimental drugs for pharmaceutical companies that couldn't get approval for human trials through legitimate channels. He'd been conducting Phase 1 and Phase 2 drug trials on unsuspecting guests, collecting data that was sold to companies developing medications for various conditions. The experiments Emily had been subjected to involved testing an experimental cognitive enhancement drug that was designed to improve memory and concentration, but had severe side effects including memory loss, personality changes, and potential brain damage. Several previous guests had suffered permanent neurological damage from the experimental treatments. Police found detailed records showing that Dr. Muller had been operating his illegal human experimentation network for over 5 years, victimizing hundreds of people across multiple countries. The victims included business executives, medical professionals, and wealthy retirees who had been attracted to the promise of cutting-edge wellness treatments. Emily's medical background allowed her to recognize the signs of experimental drug testing and cognitive manipulation, likely saving her from permanent damage. Other guests who lacked her scientific training had been subjected to months of experimental treatments that left them with lasting physical and psychological trauma. The case revealed how international criminals can exploit the medical tourism industry and platforms like Airbnb to access victims for dangerous experimental purposes. Dr. Muller's sophisticated operation had been able to operate for years because it combined legitimate-appearing medical facilities with the privacy and isolation that wealthy clients seeking alternative treatments typically desired. For Emily, the experience created lasting trauma that affected both her career in medical research and her ability to trust healthcare providers. The knowledge that she had been used as a human test subject for dangerous experimental drugs made her question the ethics of medical research and led to her eventually leaving the pharmaceutical industry. The investigation also revealed serious gaps in international oversight of medical tourism facilities and the platforms that promote them. Dr. Muller had been able to operate across multiple countries by exploiting differences in medical licensing requirements and regulatory enforcement between jurisdictions. Most disturbing was the discovery that some legitimate pharmaceutical companies had been aware of Dr. Muller's operations and had purchased research data from his illegal experiments. The case led to investigations of several major drug companies and resulted in significant changes to regulations governing human subjects research and medical tourism. Emily's story serves as a warning that the combination of international travel, alternative medicine, and luxury accommodations can create perfect covers for the most dangerous forms of exploitation. When medical treatments are combined with isolation from communication and familiar surroundings, Even highly educated professionals can become victims of elaborate, criminal schemes that exploit their trust and vulnerability. Asterisk. This penultimate story comes from a cybersecurity analyst named Alex Morrison, who discovered that some Airbnb hosts have found ways to turn their properties into sophisticated digital surveillance and control systems that can trap guests in ways that go far beyond physical confinement. Alex's experience occurred during a work trip to Austin, Texas in March 2024, when he booked what was advertised as a smart home experience designed for tech professionals. The host, who went by the name TechGuru_Austin and claimed to be a software developer specializing in home automation, had created what appeared to be the ultimate connected living space. His listing featured photos of a modern apartment filled with cutting-edge technology, voice-controlled everything, automated lighting and climate systems, smart appliances, and integrated entertainment systems that promise to anticipate guests' needs before they even realize them. Alex, being 31 years old and working in cybersecurity for a major tech company, was naturally drawn to the opportunity to experience the latest in home automation technology. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive, with guests praising the seamless integration of technology and the host's expertise in creating a truly futuristic living environment. When Alex arrived at the apartment on a Wednesday evening, he was greeted by the host, who introduced himself as Devin and appeared to be in his late 20s with the kind of casual confidence that suggested genuine technical expertise. The apartment was indeed impressive, with every device connected to a central system that Devin controlled through a sophisticated tablet interface. "This is the future of hospitality," Devin explained as he walked Alex through the apartment's features. "The system learns your preferences automatically and adjusts everything to optimize your comfort and productivity. By the end of your stay, the apartment will know you better than you know yourself." The demonstration was genuinely impressive. Devin showed how the system could adjust lighting based on the time of day and Alex's activities, how the climate control would maintain perfect temperature without any input, and how the entertainment system could curate content based on analysis of Alex's viewing habits and online activity. "The apartment connects to your devices automatically," Devin explained. "Your phone, laptop, any smart devices you have will integrate seamlessly with the home system. It's like having a personal assistant that never sleeps and is always working to make your life better." Alex was fascinated by the technical sophistication of the setup, though his cybersecurity background made him slightly concerned about the privacy implications of such comprehensive data collection. When he asked about security and data protection, Devin provided detailed explanations about encryption and data handling that seemed legitimate and professionally informed. The first night was remarkable in terms of convenience and comfort. The apartment anticipated Alex's needs perfectly, adjusting lighting as he moved between rooms, playing music that matched his mood, and even ordering coffee from a local shop to arrive exactly when he woke up. It felt like living in a science fiction movie where technology served human needs seamlessly and invisively. Thursday brought Alex's first indication that something might be wrong with the system. He noticed that his laptop was running more slowly than usual, and certain applications were behaving strangely. When he tried to access his company's VPN to work remotely, the connection kept failing despite the apartment's supposedly excellent internet service. Alex's cybersecurity training made him suspicious of these technical problems. He began monitoring his device's network activity and discovered that all of his internet traffic was being routed through proxy servers that he didn't recognize. The apartment's seamless integration wasn't just connecting his devices to the home automation system. It was intercepting and analyzing all of his digital communications. When Alex tried to disconnect his devices from the apartment's network, he discovered that they wouldn't connect to any other available networks. The apartment system had somehow locked his devices into its own network infrastructure, making it impossible for him to communicate privately or access his usual online resources. Alex realized that the smart home experience was actually a sophisticated digital imprisonment system. Devon had created technology that could completely control guests' digital lives, monitoring all their communications, intercepting their data, and preventing them from accessing outside networks or resources. The apartment's AI system wasn't just learning Alex's preferences. It was studying his work habits, personal relationships, financial information, and professional activities. Every keystroke, every phone call, every website visit was being recorded and analyzed by systems that were far more sophisticated than any legitimate home automation technology. Friday morning brought a disturbing escalation when Alex discovered that the apartment system had been accessing his work email and social media accounts, apparently using passwords and authentication tokens it had captured during his normal usage. The system had been impersonating him online, sending messages and making posts that he'd never authorized. Even more alarming was the discovery that the apartment system had initiated financial transactions using his banking information, transferring small amounts of money that were designed to test the validity of his accounts without triggering immediate fraud alerts. Alex realized that Devon was using the smart home technology to conduct sophisticated financial theft and identity fraud. When Alex confronted Devon about these discoveries, the host's demeanor changed completely. Gone was the friendly tech enthusiast, replaced by someone who clearly understood that his operation had been exposed by someone with the technical knowledge to recognize what was happening. "You shouldn't have been poking around in the system," Devon said, his voice carrying a threat that hadn't been there during their initial meeting. "Most guests just enjoy the convenience without asking too many questions. You've created a problem for both of us." Devon explained that the apartment was actually a testing ground for illegal surveillance and data theft technology that he'd been developing for sale to criminal organizations and foreign intelligence services. Guests were unknowing test subjects who provided real-world data about how the system could be used to compromise and control targets. Alex discovered that his situation was even more dangerous than he'd initially realized. The apartment system had been documenting not just his digital activities, but also his physical movements, conversations, and personal habits. Devon had been creating detailed profiles of guests that could be used for blackmail, identity theft, or targeted harassment. The smart home technology that seemed so convenient and futuristic was actually a comprehensive surveillance and control system designed to extract every possible piece of information from unsuspecting guests. Devon had been operating this system for over 2 years, victimizing hundreds of guests who thought they were experiencing cutting-edge hospitality. Alex realized that escape from the apartment would require disabling the systems that were controlling his devices and monitoring his activities. Using his cybersecurity expertise, he managed to identify vulnerabilities in Devon's network infrastructure and create a temporary pathway for his devices to connect to outside networks. Friday night, while pretending to sleep, Alex used his restored network access to contact his company's incident response team and provide them with detailed information about Devon's operation. He also documented the apartment surveillance technology and transmitted evidence to law enforcement agencies. The investigation that followed revealed that Devon was part of an international cybercriminal organization that specialized in developing surveillance technology for sale to hostile governments and criminal enterprises. The smart home apartment was just one testing facility in a network that spanned multiple countries. Devon's technology had been used to compromise the digital security of business executives, government officials, and technology professionals who had stayed in his various properties. The data collected from guests had been sold to criminal organizations and foreign intelligence services for use in corporate espionage, political blackmail, and financial fraud. The apartment's AI system had been designed not just to monitor guests, but to actively manipulate their behavior and decision-making. Devon had been testing psychological influence techniques that could be used to control people's actions without their awareness, essentially turning hospitality technology into a form of mind control. Alex discovered that he'd been specifically targeted because of his work in cybersecurity. Devon had been trying to compromise his professional credentials and access his company's security systems through the surveillance and control technology built into the apartment. The case revealed how emerging technologies like AI, home automation, and ubiquitous connectivity can be weaponized by criminals to create new forms of exploitation that traditional law enforcement agencies are unprepared to handle. Devon's operation represented a new category of crime that combined physical space control with digital surveillance and psychological manipulation. For Alex, the experience fundamentally changed his relationship with smart home technology and made him deeply suspicious of any accommodation that emphasized technological convenience over privacy protection. His expertise in cybersecurity had saved him from becoming a victim of Devon's most serious crimes. But the psychological impact of being digitally imprisoned and manipulated lasted for months. The investigation also revealed serious vulnerabilities in the review and verification systems used by platforms like Airbnb. Devon had been able to operate for years using technological sophistication to impress guests and generate positive reviews, while simultaneously using those same guests as test subjects for dangerous surveillance technology. Asterisk, this final and most disturbing story comes from a couple named Rachel and Matt, who discovered that some international Airbnb hosts have found ways to exploit guests for purposes so heinous that they challenge our basic assumptions about the safety of shared accommodations. Their experience occurred during what was supposed to be a romantic baby moon trip to a remote eco-lodge in the mountains of Romania in April 2024. Rachel, who was 28 and 6 months pregnant with their first child, and Matt, who was 30 and worked as an engineer, had wanted to take one final international trip before their baby arrived. They'd chosen what appeared to be a beautiful eco-lodge that specialized in providing peaceful retreats for expectant parents, complete with prenatal yoga, healthy organic meals, and the kind of serene natural environment that promised perfect relaxation. The host, a woman who called herself Dr. Petra Kovaci and claimed to be a former obstetrician who had retired to the mountains to create a healing sanctuary for pregnant women, had an impressive online presence and reviews that specifically praised her knowledge of prenatal care and her ability to make expectant mothers feel pampered and safe. When Rachel and Matt arrived at the lodge on a Saturday afternoon, they were immediately struck by how remote and beautiful the location was. The lodge sat in a valley surrounded by dense forests, with no other buildings visible in any direction. Dr. Kovaci met them personally, and her warm, maternal presence immediately put Rachel at ease. "Welcome to your sanctuary," Dr. Kovaci said in accented English that suggested Eastern European origins. "I've been looking forward to your visit. We're going to take such good care of you and your precious baby during your stay here." Dr. Kovaci appeared to be in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of competent, nurturing demeanor that suggested genuine medical training. She gave them a tour of the lodge, which was beautifully appointed with comfortable accommodations and appeared to be specifically designed for pregnant guests. The lodge featured a full medical facility that Dr. Kovaci claimed she used to provide prenatal checkups and health monitoring for her guests. She explained that as part of their stay, she would conduct comprehensive health assessments to ensure that both mother and baby were thriving during their retreat. "Many of my guests find that the combination of mountain air, organic nutrition, and proper medical monitoring helps them have the healthiest pregnancies possible," she explained. "I've delivered hundreds of babies over the years, and I know exactly what expectant mothers need to optimize their health and their baby's development." The first 2 days of their stay were exactly what Rachel and Matt had hoped for. The lodge provided incredible organic meals, beautiful accommodations, and the kind of peaceful environment that allowed them to focus on their growing family. Dr. Kovaci was attentive without being intrusive, providing prenatal care that seemed more thorough and personalized than what Rachel received from her doctor back home. Tuesday brought the first indication that something might be wrong. During what Dr. Kovaci called a routine prenatal wellness check, she administered several injections that she claimed were vitamins and immune system boosters designed to optimize fetal development. Rachel, who had been careful about taking only approved medications during her pregnancy, was concerned about receiving injections without consulting her regular obstetrician. When Rachel expressed these concerns, Dr. Kovaci provided detailed explanations about the safety and benefits of the treatments, showing her research papers and medical studies that appeared to support the use of these supplements during pregnancy. The documentation looked legitimate, and Dr. Kovaci's medical knowledge seemed genuine and extensive. However, the injections made Rachel feel strange in ways that she couldn't quite articulate. She experienced changes in her appetite, sleep patterns, and even her emotional responses that seemed more significant than what she'd expect from vitamin supplements. When she mentioned these effects to Dr. Kovaci, she was told that they were normal responses to optimal nutrition and indicated that the treatments were working exactly as intended. Wednesday brought more intensive treatments, including 4 infusions that Dr. Kovaci claimed would provide concentrated nutrition directly to the developing baby. Rachel's medical instincts made her uncomfortable with the increasing intensity of the interventions, but Dr. Kovaci's explanations were convincing, and her concern for Rachel's health seemed genuine. It was during the 4 treatment that Rachel noticed something that made her blood run cold. Among the medical supplies in Dr. Kovaci's treatment room, she saw vials labeled with codes that didn't match any vitamins or supplements she recognized. When she asked about these medications, Dr. Kovaci quickly changed the subject and distracted her with conversation about baby names and nursery planning. That evening, Rachel began experiencing unusual symptoms that worried both her and Matt. She felt disoriented and had difficulty concentrating, similar to the effects she'd experienced during early pregnancy but much more intense. She also noticed that her baby's movement patterns had changed significantly, with periods of hyperactivity followed by concerning stillness. Matt wanted to leave the lodge immediately and seek medical attention, but Dr. Kovaci insisted that Rachel's symptoms were normal responses to the optimization treatments and that leaving would interrupt critical prenatal care. She became increasingly insistent that they complete their full week-long program, claiming that stopping the treatments mid-course could be dangerous for both mother and baby. Thursday morning brought a horrifying discovery that changed everything. While Dr. Kovaci was preparing Rachel's morning treatments, Rachel saw her reviewing files that contained photos and medical information about dozens of pregnant women. The files included detailed documentation of pregnancies, genetic information, and what appeared to be records of babies who had been born at the lodge. Rachel realized with growing horror that Dr. Kovaci wasn't just providing prenatal care. She was conducting some kind of systematic program involving pregnant women and their babies. The treatments Rachel had been receiving weren't vitamins and immune boosters. They were experimental drugs designed to influence fetal development for unknown purposes. When Rachel confronted Dr. Kovaci about the files, the woman's warm, maternal facade disappeared completely, replaced by someone who was cold, calculating, and clearly dangerous. Dr. Kovaci explained that the lodge was actually a research facility where she conducted experiments on pregnant women and their developing babies for clients who were interested in genetic optimization and selective breeding. You and your husband were chosen specifically because of your genetic profiles, Dr. Kovaci said with chilling matter-of-factness. Our clients pay very well for babies with particular characteristics, And your combination of intelligence, physical health, and genetic markers makes your child extremely valuable. Rachel discovered that she and Matt had been lured to the lodge because someone had been monitoring their online activities, medical records, and genetic information to identify them as ideal candidates for Dr. Kovacsi's breeding program. The romantic baby moon retreat was actually a kidnapping operation designed to gain control over pregnant women and their babies. Dr. Kovacsi revealed that the lodge had been operating for several years, targeting couples with desirable genetic characteristics and using false identities and fake reviews to lure them to the remote location. The experimental treatments were designed to influence fetal development and ensure that babies were born with specific traits that were valuable to her clients. The most horrifying aspect of Dr. Kovacsi's operation was that she had no intention of allowing Rachel and Matt to leave with their baby. The lodge was equipped with a full delivery suite where Dr. Kovacsi planned to deliver Rachel's baby and then sell the child to buyers who were willing to pay enormous sums for genetically optimized infants. Rachel realized that her escape needed to be immediate and that she was fighting not just for her own life, but for her unborn child's freedom. During a moment when Dr. Kovacsi was distracted by other patients at the lodge, Rachel and Matt managed to overpower the guard who was watching them and escape into the surrounding forest. Their escape through the Romanian wilderness while Rachel was 6 months pregnant was harrowing, but they managed to reach a main road where they flagged down local police. The investigation that followed revealed that Dr. Kovacsi was part of an international human trafficking network that specialized in stealing babies from pregnant women who had been targeted for their genetic characteristics. The lodge was raided, and police discovered evidence of a sophisticated operation that had been selling babies to wealthy clients across multiple countries. Dr. Kovacsi had been working with criminal organizations that specialized in genetic analysis and had been using online data to identify and target couples with desirable characteristics for their breeding program. The investigation revealed that dozens of pregnant women had been victimized by Dr. Kovacsi's operation over the past 5 years. Many had been drugged and held against their will until their babies were born, at which point the children were sold to buyers and the mothers were either released with fabricated stories about pregnancy complications or, in some cases, eliminated to prevent them from reporting the crimes. Rachel's medical background and Matt's engineering training had helped them recognize the signs of the experimental treatments and realize the danger they were in before it was too late. Other victims who lacked their educational backgrounds had been more easily deceived by Dr. Kovacsi's medical explanations and had lost their children to the Munga trafficking operation. The case revealed how international criminal organizations can exploit the trust inherent in medical tourism and pregnancy-related travel to target some of the most vulnerable travelers, expectant parents seeking special care for their growing families. Dr. Kovacsi's operation had been able to succeed for years by exploiting parents' desire to provide the best possible care for their unborn children. For Rachel and Matt, the experience created lasting trauma that affected both their pregnancy and their ability to trust medical professionals. Rachel required extensive medical care to counteract the effects of the experimental drugs she'd been given, and both parents needed psychological counseling to process the knowledge that their child had been targeted for trafficking before birth. The investigation also revealed serious gaps in international oversight of medical tourism facilities and the platforms that promote them. Dr. Kovacsi had been able to operate across multiple countries by exploiting differences in medical licensing requirements and law enforcement cooperation between jurisdictions. Most disturbing was the discovery that the demand for genetically optimized babies had created a lucrative international market that was driving increasing sophisticated trafficking operations. Dr. Kovacsi's clients included wealthy individuals and criminal organizations from around the world who were willing to pay enormous sums for children with specific genetic characteristics. Rachel and Matt's story serves as a warning that the combination of international travel, pregnancy vulnerability, and the desire to provide optimal care for unborn children can create perfect covers for the most heinous forms of human trafficking. Their experience proves that even the most educated and cautious travelers can become victims when criminals are sophisticated enough to exploit their deepest desires to protect and nurture their families. My name is Maya, and this happened to me in Seattle during the summer of 2023, when I was 25 and working as a marketing coordinator for a tech startup. I just moved to the city for my job and was desperately searching for affordable housing. In a market that seemed designed to bankrupt anyone under 30, that's how I ended up responding to Chloe's Craigslist ad for a roommate in a beautiful Capitol Hill apartment that was way nicer than anything I could afford on my own. Chloe seemed perfect from our first meeting. She was 28, claimed to work as a freelance graphic designer, and had the kind of effortlessly stylish appearance that made me immediately want to be her friend. The apartment was gorgeous, with exposed brick walls, hardwood floors, and huge windows that flooded the space with natural light. When she offered me the room on the spot for $800 a month, I felt like I'd won the roommate lottery. I travel a lot for work, Chloe explained as she showed me around the space. So you'll have the place to yourself pretty often. I just need someone reliable who can help with the rent and won't throw parties while I'm gone. She seemed genuine and straightforward, exactly the kind of low-maintenance roommate situation I was hoping for. We signed a simple roommate agreement that afternoon, and I moved in the following weekend with nothing but excitement about starting my new life in Seattle. The first month was absolutely perfect. Chloe was friendly but not intrusive, kept the common areas clean, and was always available to answer questions about the neighborhood or recommend restaurants. She really did travel frequently, disappearing for days at a time and returning with stories about client meetings in Portland or design conferences in San Francisco. I felt lucky to have found someone so professional and easy to live with. The first red flag came in late August when I was getting ready for work and realized I was out of coffee. I knocked on Chloe's door to ask if I could borrow some, and when she didn't answer, I tried the handle. The door was unlocked, so I peeked inside to see if she was home. What I found made my stomach drop. Chloe's room was filled with mail that wasn't addressed to her. Stacks and stacks of envelopes addressed to at least a dozen different names, some opened and some still sealed. There were credit cards scattered across her desk, driver's licenses from multiple states, and what appeared to be Social Security cards in various names. It looked like the headquarters of an identity theft operation. I backed out of the room quickly, my heart pounding with the realization that my seemingly perfect roommate was clearly involved in something criminal. I spent the rest of that day at work trying to convince myself there was some innocent explanation, but I couldn't think of any legitimate reason why someone would have mail for so many different people. That evening, when Chloe returned from whatever trip she'd been on, I decided to test my suspicions. I casually mentioned that I'd been getting some mail for previous tenants and asked if she'd had the same problem. Her response was immediate and telling. "Oh yeah, the postal service is terrible about updating addresses," she said, her voice carrying just a slight edge of nervousness. "I just throw that stuff away. You should too. No point in dealing with other people's problems." But I'd seen the opened envelopes in her room, the carefully organized stacks of documents, the obvious signs that she wasn't just throwing anything away. That night, I started paying closer attention to Chloe's behavior and noticed things I'd previously dismissed as quirks or coincidences. She never used the same credit card twice when we went out together, always pulling different cards from her wallet like she was choosing from a collection. She received packages almost daily, but they were addressed to different names, and she always claimed they were for her various freelance projects. Most telling was her work setup. I'd never actually seen her doing any graphic design. Despite her claims about client deadlines and creative projects, the breakthrough came in early September when I was sorting through our communal mail and found an envelope addressed to me that had already been opened and carefully resealed. Inside was a pre-approved credit card offer that I'd never applied for, but someone had clearly completed the application using my information. My hands shook as I realized that Chloe hadn't just been stealing mail from random people. She'd been using my personal information to commit identity theft. I immediately started checking my credit reports and bank statements, and what I found was devastating. Over the past month, someone had opened 3 credit cards in my name, taken out a small personal loan, and even attempted to change the address on my bank account. The applications had been submitted using information that only someone with access to my personal documents could have known: details about my employment history, previous addresses, and even my mother's maiden name. Asterisk, the realization that Chloe had been going through my personal belongings and stealing my identity while pretending to be my friend made me feel physically sick. I'd trusted her with access to my home, my mail, my personal space, and she'd used that trust to systematically steal my identity and potentially ruin my financial future. I knew I needed to gather evidence before confronting her or going to the police. Over the next few days, I carefully documented everything I could find, taking photos of the mail in her room, the multiple credit cards, and the various identification documents. I also set up a hidden camera in the common area to see if I could catch her going through my belongings. The camera footage was even more damning than I'd expected. It showed Chloe regularly searching through my mail, photographing my bank statements and credit card offers, and even going through my purse when I left it in the living room. She was methodical and professional about it, clearly someone who had done this many times before. The most disturbing discovery came when I found her laptop open one afternoon and saw that she had detailed files on not just me, but on dozens of other people. She'd been running a sophisticated identity theft operation, using information stolen from roommates, neighbors, and anyone else she could access to create fake identities and commit financial fraud. The files contained photos of driver's licenses, social security cards, bank statements, and credit reports from people across the country. She had spreadsheets tracking which identities she was using for different purposes, noting credit scores, available credit limits, and successful applications for loans and credit cards. It was like looking at the business records of a professional criminal enterprise. When I finally confronted Chloe with the evidence I'd gathered, her transformation was immediate and terrifying. The friendly, stylish roommate disappeared completely, replaced by someone who was cold, calculating, and clearly dangerous. "You shouldn't have been snooping around," she said, her voice carrying a threat that made every hair on my body stand up. "Now you've created a problem for both of us." Chloe revealed that identity theft was her full-time job, and that she'd been using the roommate arrangement to gain access to victims who would be slow to discover the fraud. She specifically targeted young professionals who were busy with their careers and might not notice unusual activity on their accounts for weeks or months. She'd perfected the system over several years, moving from city to city and finding new roommates every few months before her victims could figure out what was happening. The freelance graphic design story was just a cover that explained her flexible schedule and frequent travel, while also making her seem creative and trustworthy. What made Chloe's operation particularly insidious was how she used the intimacy of the roommate relationship to lower her victims' guard. By living with them, sharing meals, and building what appeared to be genuine friendships, she gained access to their personal information and created situations where stealing their mail and documents seemed like innocent mistakes rather than deliberate theft. Asterisk. The psychological manipulation was just as sophisticated as the financial fraud. Chloe had studied her victims' personalities and vulnerabilities, using their desire for friendship and connection to make them overlook suspicious behavior and trust her with increasingly personal information. When I threatened to call the police, Chloe's response revealed the full scope of her criminal network. She wasn't working alone. She was part of an organized identity theft ring that had been operating across multiple states, with connections to people who could make my life very difficult if I caused problems for their operation. "You have no idea how deep this goes," she said, pulling out her phone to show me photos of my workplace, my parents' house, and other locations that were important to me. "We know everything about you, and we have people who can reach you anywhere. You can call the police if you want, but think carefully about whether you want to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder." The threats were sophisticated and credible, designed to make me too afraid to report her crimes or interfere with her operation. But I'd already made the decision to fight back, knowing that my silence would only enable her to victimize more people. I'd been secretly working with a fraud investigator from my bank and a detective from the Seattle Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, providing them with all the evidence I'd gathered about Chloe's operation. When they arrested her, they discovered that my case was just one small part of a massive identity theft ring that had stolen millions of dollars from victims across the country. The investigation revealed that Chloe and her associates had been using the roommate system to target over 200 people in the past 3 years, stealing identities and committing financial fraud on a scale that investigators called unprecedented. They'd perfected the art of building trust with their victims, while simultaneously destroying their financial lives. Chloe was eventually sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for her role in the identity theft ring, but the damage she'd done to my life and the lives of her other victims was irreversible. It took me over 2 years to fully restore my credit and undo all the fraudulent accounts she'd opened in my name, and the emotional trauma of having my trust so completely violated affected my ability to form new relationships for years afterward. The case also revealed serious gaps in how identity theft is investigated and prosecuted, particularly when it involves intimate relationships like roommates or romantic partners. The personal nature of these crimes makes them harder to detect and investigate, while the emotional manipulation involved makes victims less likely to report them or pursue prosecution. For me, the experience completely changed how I think about privacy, trust, and the information we share with people in our daily lives. Chloe's ability to steal my identity so completely using nothing but access to my mail and personal belongings made me realize how vulnerable we all are to people who understand how to exploit the trust that makes normal relationships possible. Most chilling aspect of Chloe's operation was how perfectly it exploited the vulnerabilities that come with modern urban living. Young professionals moving to new cities for work are exactly the kind of people who need roommates to afford housing, but they're also perfect targets for identity theft because they're often isolated from family and support networks that might notice unusual behavior. Chloe's story serves as a warning that the people we live with have access to our most private information and our most vulnerable moments. When that access is exploited by someone with criminal intentions, the damage can be devastating and long-lasting. affecting not just our finances but our ability to trust others and feel safe in our own homes. Asterisk. This story comes from my friend James, a 28-year-old high school teacher who moved to Denver in the fall of 2023 for a new job. James had always been careful about choosing roommates, but the housing market in Denver was so competitive that he felt lucky when Marcus, a graduate student at the University of Colorado, responded to his Craigslist ad within hours of posting. Marcus seemed like the ideal roommate, quiet, studious, and responsible. He claimed to be working on his PhD in biochemistry and said he spent most of his time at the lab or library, so he wouldn't be around the apartment much. When they met for coffee to discuss the arrangement, Marcus impressed James with his knowledge of scientific research and his mature, professional demeanor. "I'm really focused on my studies right now," Marcus explained. "I need a quiet place to live where I can concentrate on my dissertation research. I'm not much of a partier, and I prefer to keep to myself most of the time." The apartment James had found was a 2-bedroom place in a nice neighborhood near his school, and Marcus's share of the rent would make it affordable for both of them. Marcus paid his first month's rent and security deposit in cash, which he explained was normal for graduate students who often got paid through research stipends rather than regular paychecks. For the first few weeks, Marcus was exactly the roommate James had hoped for. He was quiet, clean, and rarely home during normal hours. James would see him leaving early in the morning with a backpack full of books and returning late at night, usually after James had already gone to bed. It seemed like Marcus really was dedicated to his graduate studies. The first sign that something was wrong came in October, when James started noticing unusual activity around their apartment building. There were people coming and going at all hours, often meeting briefly with someone in the parking lot before driving away. James initially assumed it was just normal city activity, but the pattern was too regular and secretive to be coincidental. More concerning was the discovery that Marcus always seemed to have plenty of money despite claiming to live on a graduate student stipend. He drove a newer car than James could afford on his teacher's salary, wore expensive clothes, and never seemed worried about finances. When James asked about it, Marcus claimed he came from a wealthy family and received financial support from his parents. The explanation seemed plausible, but James's teacher instincts told him something was off about Marcus's story. Graduate students, even wealthy ones, usually had some visible signs of academic stress: papers to grade, research deadlines, thesis anxiety. Marcus never seemed to have any of the normal pressures that came with advanced academic work. In November, James's suspicions turned to alarm when he found unusual items in their shared living spaces. There were small plastic bags in the kitchen trash that had contained unknown substances, digital scales hidden in the utility closet, and burner phones that Marcus claimed were for research purposes but never seemed to be used for actual phone calls. The breakthrough came on a Saturday morning when James woke up early and found Marcus in the kitchen with several men he'd never seen before. They were clearly in the middle of some kind of business transaction, with money and small packages changing hands. When they saw James, the conversation stopped immediately, and Marcus's friendly demeanor shifted to something much colder. "These are lab partners from my research group," Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning that James should not ask any more questions. "We're working on a project that requires some unusual materials." But James had seen enough drug deals during his years as a high school teacher to recognize what was happening in his kitchen. Marcus wasn't a graduate student conducting biochemistry research. He was a drug dealer using the graduate student persona as cover for his operation. The realization that James had been unknowingly living with a drug dealer made him panic about the legal implications for his career and safety. As a teacher, any association with illegal drugs could cost him his job and destroy his ability to work in education. He needed to get away from Marcus immediately, but he also needed to be careful about how he handled the situation. James began documenting Marcus's activities, noting the times when strange people came to the apartment, the unusual items he found around the house, and the inconsistencies in Marcus's story about his academic work. He also started researching the University of Colorado's biochemistry program and discovered that no one named Marcus was enrolled in their graduate program. Asterisk. The fake identity was sophisticated and well-maintained. Marcus had created detailed stories about his research, his professors, and his academic goals that were believable enough to fool someone who wasn't familiar with graduate school. He even had textbooks and academic papers that supported his cover story, though James realized they were probably just props. When James tried to verify Marcus's identity through the university, he discovered that the person Marcus claimed to be didn't exist. The real Marcus, whose identity had been borrowed, was a graduate student at a different university who had no connection to Denver or the drug operation. The situation became dangerous in December when James accidentally interrupted what appeared to be a major drug transaction. He came home early from work due to a snow day and found his apartment filled with people he didn't recognize, along with large quantities of drugs and cash spread across their dining room table. Marcus's reaction was immediate and threatening. Instead of the quiet, studious persona he usually maintained, he became aggressive and made it clear that James had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. "You need to forget what you saw here," Marcus said, his voice carrying a menace that James had never heard before. "This doesn't concern you, and it would be very unhealthy for you to make it your business." The threat was sophisticated and carefully worded to avoid direct language that could be used as evidence, but the message was clear. James's safety depended on his silence about Marcus's drug operation. James realized that his apartment had become the headquarters for a significant drug distribution network, and that Marcus had specifically chosen to live with a teacher because educators were seen as trustworthy and unlikely to be suspected of criminal activity. The graduate student cover story wasn't just about fooling James. It was about creating a believable explanation for Marcus's activities that would satisfy neighbors, landlords, and anyone else who might become curious about his lifestyle. Operation was sophisticated enough to suggest that Marcus was working for a larger criminal organization rather than operating independently. The people who came to the apartment were clearly part of a structured hierarchy, and the volume of drugs and money involved indicated a major distribution network. James made the difficult decision to contact the D, knowing that cooperating with law enforcement could put him in danger, but recognizing that his silence would enable Marcus to continue using their shared living space for criminal activities. The investigation that followed revealed that Marcus was a mid-level dealer in an international drug trafficking organization that specialized in synthetic drugs manufactured in underground laboratories. The timing of James's report was crucial, as it allowed law enforcement to intercept a major shipment of fentanyl that was being distributed through Marcus's network. The drugs that were seized would have been enough to kill thousands of people, making James's decision to come forward potentially life-saving for countless unknown victims. Marcus was arrested along with dozens of other members of the trafficking organization, but not before he made it clear that James's cooperation with law enforcement had put him on the organization's list of people who needed to be silenced. The threats were specific and credible enough that James had to relocate to a different city and change jobs to ensure his safety. The investigation revealed that Marcus's organization had been using the roommate system to establish legitimate appearing safe houses in multiple cities, specifically targeting professionals like teachers, nurses, and social workers whose careers would be destroyed by any association with drug crimes. The criminal organization understood that these victims would be highly motivated to remain silent rather than risk their professional reputations. For James, The experience destroyed his sense of safety and his ability to trust people in intimate, living situations. The knowledge that he'd been unknowingly participating in a criminal enterprise and that his career could have been destroyed by Marcus's activities created lasting anxiety about his professional reputation and personal security. The case also highlighted how criminal organizations exploit the trust and vulnerability that come with shared living arrangements. Marcus had specifically chosen to target someone whose career would be endangered by any association with drug crimes, creating a victim who would be highly motivated to remain silent about criminal activities. James's story serves as a warning that roommate relationships can be weaponized by criminals who understand how to exploit the practical necessities that force people to share living spaces with strangers. The intimacy and trust that make these arrangements possible also create opportunities for exploitation that can destroy victims' careers, safety, and sense of security. This horrifying story comes from a 24-year-old nursing student named Emma, who discovered in the spring of 2024 that her female roommate Sarah had been using their shared living arrangement to conduct an elaborate, stalking operation that went far beyond simple privacy violations. Emma had moved to Portland for nursing school and found Sarah through a roommate matching app specifically designed for female students and young professionals. Sarah seemed perfect. She was 26, worked as a social media coordinator for a local nonprofit, and presented herself as someone who understood the challenges of being a young woman trying to build a career in a new city. The apartment they shared was in a trendy neighborhood near Emma's school, and Sarah had been living there for over a year before Emma moved in. She decorated the space beautifully and had established routines and relationships with neighbors that made the building feel safe and welcoming. "I love having female roommates," Sarah explained when they first met. "We can look out for each other, share clothes, and have someone to talk to about work stress and relationship drama. It's like having a built-in support system." For the first few months, Sarah was exactly the supportive roommate Emma had hoped for. She was friendly and interested in Emma's nursing program, always asking about her classes, clinical rotations, and study schedule. She seemed genuinely invested in Emma's success and often offered helpful advice about managing stress and staying organized. Sarah also appeared to be well-connected socially and professionally, frequently mentioning friends, co-workers, and networking events that suggested she had a rich and active life outside their apartment. She often invited Emma to join her for social activities, though Emma usually declined due to her demanding school schedule. The first indication that something was wrong came in April when Emma started noticing that Sarah knew details about her personal life that Emma was certain she'd never shared. Sarah would make comments about Emma's study groups, her clinical supervisor's personality, and even specific conversations Emma had had with classmates, information that Emma couldn't remember discussing with her roommate. Initially, Emma assumed she'd mentioned these things in passing and simply forgotten about it. Living with someone meant sharing a lot of casual conversation, and it seemed reasonable that Sarah would remember details that Emma herself had forgotten discussing. But as the pattern continued, Emma became more conscious of what she did and didn't tell Sarah about her daily activities. She realized that Sarah was consistently demonstrating knowledge about Emma's schedule, relationships, and activities that went far beyond what Emma had actually shared. The revelation came accidentally in May when Emma was using Sarah's laptop to print a nursing assignment and discovered files containing detailed information about Emma's daily activities, relationships, and personal communications. Sarah had been systematically documenting Emma's life with the thoroughness of a private investigator. The files contained screenshots of Emma's social media posts, photos of her with friends and classmates, detailed timelines of her daily activities, and even transcripts of phone conversations that Emma had had in the privacy of her bedroom. Sarah had been conducting comprehensive surveillance of Emma's life while pretending to be a supportive friend and roommate. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Sarah had been catfishing Emma's friends and potential romantic interests, creating fake social media profiles to gather information about Emma's relationships and personal interactions. She'd been pretending to be other nursing students, potential dating matches, and even prospective employers to extract information about Emma's life and activities. Emma realized with growing horror that Sarah had been using their roommate relationship as cover for an elaborate stalking operation that went far beyond simple curiosity or concern. Sarah had been systematically invading every aspect of Emma's privacy while maintaining the facade of a caring and supportive friend. The documentation Emma found revealed that Sarah's stalking activities had been going on since before Emma moved in. Sarah had been researching Emma's background, family relationships, and personal history for weeks before they'd ever met, using information gathered from social media, public records, and other online sources to create the perfect roommate persona. Sarah had specifically targeted Emma because her nursing school schedule and demanding academic workload made her vulnerable to someone offering friendship and support. Sarah had studied Emma's personality and vulnerabilities, crafting her approach to exploit Emma's desire for a female friend who would understand the challenges of her academic program. When Emma confronted Sarah about the files and surveillance activities, Sarah's response was immediate and chilling. Instead of denying the stalking or showing remorse, Sarah revealed that she'd been conducting similar operations on multiple targets and that Emma was just one of several women whose lives she'd been systematically documenting and invading. You have such an interesting life, Sarah said with disturbing casualness. I like learning about people, understanding what makes them tick. You should be flattered that someone finds you fascinating enough to study so carefully. Sarah revealed that she'd been using the social media coordinator job as cover for her stalking activities, claiming that her research on Emma and other targets was actually professional work related to understanding online behavior and social media patterns. The explanation was sophisticated enough to provide plausible deniability for her surveillance activities. The scope of Sarah's operation was vast and sophisticated. She'd been targeting multiple women across several cities, using roommate relationships, fake online personas, and professional networking to gain access to their personal lives and private information. She'd created detailed profiles of dozens of women, documenting their relationships, career activities, and personal vulnerabilities. Emma discovered that Sarah had been selling some of the information she gathered to unknown clients, possibly for use in identity theft, harassment campaigns, or other criminal activities. The stalking wasn't just about satisfying Sarah's personal obsessions. It was a commercial operation that turned women's private lives into marketable commodities. The psychological manipulation involved in Sarah's operation was as sophisticated as the technical surveillance. Sarah had studied her target's personalities and emotional needs, crafting relationships and interactions designed to extract maximum information while maintaining their trust and affection. Emma realized that everything about her relationship with Sarah had been calculated and false. The supportive conversations, the offers of friendship, even the apartment they shared had all been elements of an elaborate deception designed to facilitate Sarah's stalking activities. When Emma tried to end the roommate arrangement and move out, Sarah's behavior became increasingly threatening and unstable. She began making comments about Emma's family members, work contacts, and other relationships that suggested she had the ability to cause problems in multiple areas of Emma's life. You can't just walk away from our friendship, Sarah said with disturbing intensity. I know too much about you, and I have connections you don't even know about. It would be very easy for me to make your life complicated if you try to cut me out. The threats were sophisticated and designed to exploit Emma's vulnerabilities as a nursing student, whose career could be damaged by any scandal or controversy. Sarah had specifically gathered information that could be used to sabotage Emma's relationships, academic standing, and professional prospects. Emma's decision to contact law enforcement led to the discovery of a complex criminal operation that had been targeting young professional women across multiple states. Sarah was part of a network that specialized in gathering personal information for use in various criminal schemes, including identity theft, blackmail, and harassment campaigns. The investigation revealed that Sarah and her associates had been victimizing dozens of women, using intimate relationships like roommate arrangements to gain access to their personal lives and private information. The operation was sophisticated enough to suggest professional training in surveillance and psychological manipulation techniques. Sarah was eventually arrested and charged with multiple felonies related to stalking, invasion of privacy, and identity theft. The investigation revealed that she'd been conducting similar operations for over 5 years, targeting vulnerable women and exploiting their trust to gather information for criminal purposes. For Emma, the experience created lasting trauma that affected her ability to trust others and feel safe in intimate relationships. The knowledge that someone had been systematically invading her privacy while pretending to be her friend destroyed her sense of security and made her question her ability to recognize dangerous people. The case also revealed serious gaps in how stalking crimes are investigated and prosecuted, particularly when they involve sophisticated technical surveillance and psychological manipulation. Sarah's use of technology and fake personas made her activities difficult to detect and investigate using traditional law enforcement methods. Emma's story serves as a warning that the intimacy and trust that make roommate relationships possible can also be exploited by predators who understand how to use friendship and support as covers for criminal activities. The emotional manipulation involved in these crimes can be as damaging as the privacy violations, leaving victims questioning their judgment and ability to form safe relationships. This story comes from Amanda, a 28-year-old accountant who learned the hard way that some roommates are actually professional con artists who use shared living arrangements to conduct long-term financial fraud operations. Amanda's experience occurred in Miami during the winter of 2023, when she was looking for a roommate to help with the cost of her downtown apartment. James seemed like the answer to her prayers when he responded to her roommate ad. He was 32, claimed to work as a business consultant specializing in startup companies, and had the kind of polished professional appearance that suggested financial success and stability. When they met for coffee to discuss the arrangement, James impressed Amanda with his knowledge of business and finance, speaking confidently about investments, market trends, and entrepreneurial opportunities. "I travel a lot for work," James explained, "so I need a place where I can crash between consulting gigs. I'm usually only home a few days a week, so you'd basically have the place to yourself most of the time." James offered to pay 3 months of rent upfront in cash, which he said was his preferred way of handling finances to avoid the complications of bank transfers and credit checks. The immediate cash payment was appealing to Amanda, who had been struggling to find a reliable roommate and was behind on some bills due to an unexpected car repair. The apartment was a beautiful 2-bedroom place with a view of Biscayne Bay, and James's contribution would make it easily affordable for both of them. He moved in immediately, bringing only a few suitcases and claiming that most of his belongings were in storage until he decided whether Miami would be his permanent base of operations. For the first month, James was exactly the roommate Amanda had hoped for. He was rarely home, always well-dressed when she did see him, and contributed to household expenses without complaint. He frequently mentioned successful consulting projects and seemed to have a steady stream of income from various business ventures. James also appeared to be well-connected professionally, often receiving calls from what sounded like important clients and discussing deals that involved significant amounts of money. Amanda, who worked for a small accounting firm, was impressed by James's apparent success and began to see him as a mentor who might be able to help her advance her own career. The first red flag came in February when Amanda noticed that James's expensive lifestyle didn't quite match up with his claimed work schedule. He was supposedly traveling constantly for consulting gigs, but he never seemed to have the kind of detailed work stress that Amanda associated with high-level business consulting. He also never seemed to work from home, despite claiming to run a consulting business. More concerning was James's increasing interest in Amanda's work and financial situation. He began asking detailed questions about her accounting clients, her firm's procedures, and her access to financial systems. Amanda mentioned that she handled bookkeeping for several small businesses. James became particularly interested in the details of those arrangements. "I might be able to help you develop some of those client relationships," James suggested. "Small businesses always need consulting services, and I could probably bring some additional value to your existing accounts." James's offers of professional help seemed generous, but Amanda's accounting training made her cautious about mixing personal and professional relationships. She politely declined his suggestions, but noticed that James continued to ask probing questions about her work and clients. In March, Amanda discovered that James had been going through her personal financial documents while she was at work. She found her bank statements, tax returns, and client files in slightly different positions than she'd left them, suggesting that someone had been examining them carefully and trying to put them back exactly as they'd found them. When Amanda set up a hidden camera to monitor her room, the footage confirmed her suspicions. James was systematically photographing her personal documents, client information, and financial records. He was also accessing her laptop when she wasn't home, apparently copying files and gathering information about her accounting work. The realization that James had been conducting systematic surveillance of her financial life made Amanda panic about the potential consequences for her clients and her career. As an accountant, she had access to sensitive financial information that could be used for fraud, and any breach of client confidentiality could destroy her professional reputation. Amanda began investigating James's background and discovered that his claims about being a successful business consultant were completely fabricated. There was no record of him working for any of the companies he'd mentioned, and his supposed consulting business didn't exist in any business databases or professional directories. Even more alarming was the discovery that James wasn't his real name and that he'd been using multiple identities across different cities to conduct similar operations. Amanda found online records suggesting that he'd been arrested in other states for financial fraud and identity theft, but had apparently changed his name and moved to avoid prosecution. The breakthrough came when Amanda discovered that James had been using the information he'd stolen from her to access her clients' financial accounts. He'd been systematically draining money from small business accounts that Amanda managed, using his knowledge of her procedures and client relationships to conduct sophisticated fraud operations. James had been particularly interested in Amanda's clients because they were small businesses that were less likely to have sophisticated fraud detection systems and more likely to trust their accountant's recommendations about financial transactions. He'd been using Amanda's credentials and client relationships to conduct fraud that would be difficult to trace back to him. When Amanda confronted James with evidence of his fraud activities, his transformation was immediate and terrifying. The polished, professional persona disappeared completely, replaced by someone who was clearly dangerous and had no intention of allowing Amanda to interfere with his operation. "You have no idea how deep this goes," James said, his voice carrying a menace that made Amanda fear for her safety. I have information about you and your clients that could destroy all of your lives. You can call the police if you want, but think carefully about whether you're prepared for the consequences. James revealed that he'd been working with a sophisticated criminal organization that specialized in financial fraud and had connections to enforce their threats against anyone who interfered with their operations. He'd been using the roommate arrangement not just to steal Amanda's personal information, but to gain access to her professional network and client base. The fraud operation was much larger than Amanda had realized. James and his associates had been targeting accountants, bookkeepers, and other financial professionals across multiple states, using roommate relationships to gain access to their client networks and conduct large-scale financial theft. Amanda's cooperation with law enforcement led to the discovery of a criminal organization that had stolen millions of dollars from small businesses by exploiting the trust relationships between those businesses and their financial service providers. James had been specifically targeting female accountants who worked for small firms, believing they would be more vulnerable to his manipulation and less likely to have sophisticated security measures. The investigation revealed that James's operation had been responsible for destroying dozens of small businesses and ruining the careers of multiple accounting professionals who had unknowingly provided access to their clients' financial information. The psychological and financial damage he'd caused was devastating and long-lasting. For Amanda, the experience destroyed her accounting career and created lasting trauma that affected her ability to trust clients, colleagues, and roommates. The knowledge that she'd been unknowingly facilitating the theft of her clients' money created guilt and anxiety that persisted long after James's arrest and conviction. The case also revealed serious vulnerabilities in how small businesses protect their financial information and how accounting professionals verify the identity and credentials of people who have access to their personal and professional lives. James's operation succeeded because it exploited the trust that makes both roommate relationships and professional services possible. Amanda's story serves as a warning that financial professionals are particularly attractive targets for sophisticated con artists who understand how to exploit their access to client information and financial systems. The intimate nature of roommate relationships can provide the perfect cover for long-term fraud operations that are difficult to detect until the significant damage has been done. Asterisk, this story comes from Lisa, a 26-year-old pharmacy technician who discovered that her roommate had been using their shared living arrangement to conduct a sophisticated prescription drug theft operation that put both Lisa's career and safety in jeopardy. Lisa had moved to Phoenix in the summer of 2023 to start a new job at a large pharmacy chain and was looking for a roommate to help with expenses. Kate seemed perfect when they met through a roommate finding app. She was 29, claimed to work in healthcare administration, and appeared to understand the demands and responsibilities that came with working in the medical field. "It's so great to find another healthcare worker," Kate said when they first met. "We'll understand each other's schedules and the stress that comes with working in medicine. Plus, we can share professional connections and maybe help each other advance our careers." Kate moved into Lisa's apartment in August, bringing what appeared to be professional medical textbooks and claiming to work for a large hospital system managing patient records and insurance claims. She was knowledgeable about medical terminology and procedures, making her claims about working in healthcare seem credible and legitimate. For the first few weeks, Kate was an ideal roommate. She was clean, quiet, and respectful of Lisa's need to study for her pharmacy certification exams. Kate often worked irregular hours, which she explained was normal for healthcare administration roles that required coordination between different departments and shifts. The first sign that something was wrong came in September when Lisa noticed that Kate was unusually interested in the details of Lisa's work at the pharmacy. Kate asked detailed questions about inventory procedures, prescription handling protocols, and the security measures used to prevent drug theft. Initially, Lisa assumed Kate's questions were just professional curiosity from someone who worked in healthcare administration and might need to understand pharmacy operations for her job. But Kate's questions became increasingly specific and focused on information that seemed more relevant to someone planning to circumvent security measures than someone trying to understand legitimate operations. Kate was particularly interested in Lisa's access to controlled substances, the procedures for handling high-value medications, and the times when the pharmacy was most vulnerable to theft. When Lisa mentioned the strict protocols around opioid prescriptions, Kate's interest became noticeably more intense. The breakthrough came in October when Lisa found prescription bottles in Kate's room that contained medications prescribed to people whose names Lisa didn't recognize. When Lisa asked about them, Kate claimed they belonged to elderly relatives she was helping to manage their medications. But the story didn't quite add up. The prescription labels showed medications that were filled at different pharmacies across the city, and the dates suggested that Kate had been collecting these prescription bottles over a period of several months. Some of the bottles contained high-value controlled substances that would be closely monitored by pharmacy systems. Lisa realized with growing alarm that Kate might be involved in prescription drug theft or fraud. As a pharmacy technician, Lisa knew that any association with drug crimes could destroy her career and potentially result in criminal charges. She needed to investigate Kate's activities carefully, while protecting herself from legal liability. Using her knowledge of pharmacy systems, Lisa began tracking the prescription numbers and patient names on the bottles she'd found in Kate's possession. What she discovered was evidence of a sophisticated prescription fraud operation that involved multiple pharmacies and dozens of fake patient identities. Kate had been using stolen personal information to create fake patient profiles and obtain legitimate prescriptions for controlled substances. She'd been targeting elderly patients whose identities were easier to steal and who were less likely to notice fraudulent activity on their medical records. The operation was particularly insidious because Kate had been using her knowledge of healthcare systems to exploit vulnerabilities in prescription monitoring and patient verification procedures. She understood exactly how to manipulate the system to obtain controlled substances without triggering the automated alerts that were designed to prevent prescription fraud. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Kate had been trying to recruit Lisa as an accomplice in her prescription theft operation. Kate's seemingly innocent questions about pharmacy procedures had actually been attempts to identify opportunities for insider theft and to assess Lisa's willingness to participate in illegal activities. When Lisa realized the scope of Kate's criminal operation, she also discovered that Kate's claims about working in healthcare administration were completely false. Kate had no legitimate connection to any hospital or medical facility, and her knowledge of healthcare procedures came from her experience conducting prescription fraud rather than legitimate work experience. Kate's background check revealed a history of drug-related arrests in other states and evidence that she'd been conducting similar operations in multiple cities. She specifically targeted pharmacy workers and other healthcare professionals as roommates because their credentials and access to medical systems made them valuable assets for prescription fraud operations. The most frightening discovery was that Kate had been attempting to steal Lisa's professional credentials and use them to obtain controlled substances directly from pharmaceutical suppliers. Kate had been photographing Lisa's pharmacy technician license, work ID, and other professional documentation to create fake credentials for use in drug theft operations. When Lisa confronted Kate about her criminal activities, Kate's response revealed the full scope of her operation and the danger that Lisa was in for discovering it. Kate wasn't working alone. She was part of a larger criminal organization that specialized in prescription drug theft and had connections to enforce their operations against anyone who interfered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Kate sighed, her voice carrying a threat that made Lisa fear for her safety. This operation involves people who don't tolerate interference, and you've seen too much to just walk away. You can either become part of this or become a problem that needs to be solved. Kate revealed that her organization had been targeting healthcare workers across multiple states, using roommate relationships to gain access to medical facilities and prescription systems. They'd been particularly successful at recruiting pharmacy workers, nurses, and medical technicians who had access to controlled substances and patient information. The organization's methods were sophisticated and involved detailed surveillance of potential targets before approaching them with roommate arrangements. They'd been studying Lisa's background, work schedule, and personal vulnerabilities for weeks before Kate moved in, crafting an approach designed to exploit Lisa's need for a roommate and her trust in fellow healthcare workers. Lisa's decision to cooperate with law enforcement led to discovery of a multi-state prescription fraud operation that had stolen millions of dollars worth of controlled substances and put countless patients at risk by compromising their medical records and prescription histories. The investigation revealed that Kate and her associates had been responsible for a significant portion of the prescription drug theft in the southwestern United States, using their network of healthcare worker accomplices to access controlled substances from multiple sources and distribute them through illegal channels. Kate was eventually arrested and charged with multiple felonies related to prescription fraud, identity theft, and drug trafficking. The investigation revealed that she'd been conducting similar operations for over 5 years, targeting vulnerable healthcare workers and exploiting their professional access for criminal purposes. For Lisa, the experience created lasting trauma that affected both her career in pharmacy and her ability to trust roommates and colleagues. The knowledge that she'd been specifically targeted for her professional credentials and that her career could have been destroyed by Kate's activities made her question her judgment and feel unsafe in professional environments. The case also revealed serious vulnerabilities in how prescription monitoring systems detect and prevent insider theft, particularly when criminals have detailed knowledge of healthcare procedures and access to legitimate professional credentials. Lisa's story serves as a warning that healthcare workers are particularly attractive targets for criminals who understand how to exploit their professional access and responsibilities. The trust that makes healthcare systems function can also be weaponized by people who understand how to manipulate medical professionals and exploit their commitment to helping others. Asterisk. These 7 roommate horror stories reveal how the intimate nature of shared living arrangements can be exploited by people with malicious intentions who understand how to use trust, friendship, and mutual support as covers for criminal activities. From identity theft and financial fraud to blackmail and cult recruitment, these cases demonstrate that the people we live with have access to our most private information and our most vulnerable moments. What makes these stories particularly disturbing is how the perpetrators exploited the very qualities that make roommate relationships appealing: the opportunity for friendship, mutual support, and shared experiences. Each victim thought they were gaining a helpful companion, but instead found themselves targeted by sophisticated criminals who understood how to use intimacy and trust as weapons. Maya's experience with the identity thief Chloe showed how roommates can systematically steal personal information while maintaining the facade of friendship. James discovered that his quiet graduate student roommate was actually running a drug operation that put his career and safety at risk. Emma learned that her supportive female roommate was conducting elaborate stalking operations disguised as friendship and concern. Amanda's con artist roommate used their shared living arrangement to conduct financial fraud that destroyed her accounting career, while Lisa found herself targeted by prescription drug thieves who wanted to exploit her access to controlled substances. Ryan's social roommate was actually a blackmail artist who used parties and social events to gather compromising material about successful young professionals. Finally, Mia's story revealed how cult recruiters use roommate relationships to target vulnerable young people and draw them into dangerous organizations that exploit their desire for community and personal growth. These cases highlight several common patterns that make roommate relationships particularly vulnerable to exploitation. The perpetrators consistently targeted people during vulnerable life transitions, recent graduates, career changers, people new to cities, when victims were most likely to need support and least likely to have strong local support networks. Criminals also exploited the practical necessities that force people to share living spaces with strangers. In expensive housing markets, young professionals often have no choice but to live with people they barely know, creating opportunities for predators who understand how to present themselves as ideal roommates while harboring dangerous intentions. Perhaps most importantly, these stories demonstrate how the intimacy of shared living arrangements can be weaponized by people who understand how to exploit trust, vulnerability, and the human need for connection. The daily interactions that make roommate relationships possible, sharing meals, discussing personal problems, providing mutual support, also create opportunities for gathering intelligence, building manipulation strategies, and maintaining control over victims. For anyone considering a roommate arrangement, these stories serve as crucial reminders that the personal connections and mutual support that make shared living appealing also create unique vulnerabilities that don't exist in other types of housing arrangements. While the vast majority of roommates are honest people seeking mutually beneficial living situations, the minority who have malicious intentions can cause devastating and long-lasting harm. The key to protecting yourself isn't to avoid roommate arrangements entirely, but to understand the unique risks they present and to maintain appropriate boundaries around personal information, financial access, and emotional dependency. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Maintain connections to people outside your living situation. And remember that no housing arrangement is worth compromising your safety, privacy, or well-being. These stories remind us that evil can hide behind the most appealing facades, and that the very qualities that make us good roommates, our willingness to trust, our desire to help others, our openness to new friendships, can also make us vulnerable to those who would exploit our generosity and trust for their own dark purposes. Sweet dreams, and choose your roommates carefully.